My story, really quickly, not to go on too long, but my motivation was always to get rich as a kid. I see my parents, they struggled for money. All their life they struggled and they never had enough money. And my motivation was always make loads of money so I can buy my dad a new car, or make loads of money so I can solve their money problems. And I went down the same route that I think a lot of us just end up going down. And I got a job and I saved money. And I ended up living in a mobile home, so it wasn't really working out too well for me. And then I ended up having an accident. The best thing that ever happened to me in my life was I broke my back, which is mad, but that's life sometimes. And that changed the direction of my life, because I ended up lying in the hospital bed, looking at the ceiling, and now I didn't want to be rich anymore. All I wanted was my health back, okay? And I went on this journey of taking responsibility for the injury. Initially I was like, surgeons just fixed me, I had a few surgeries, I was still in bits. They were saying, Dinny, we'll get you walking with a limp again, that's all we can do for you, at best. And so I went down the rabbit hole of health and fitness, and over the course of 2 years, I went from broken back to doing an Ironman triathlon. I got really fit, but I found with the fitness and the health came a confidence and self-belief. I don't think I'd have been stood here doing this before I broke my back. Heck no, okay? But I found that the health and fitness, it made me a different person. And I was like, all right, this is awesome. Maybe I'll do this as a job. If I can teach other people how to feel like this. That was my sort of introduction into fitness, and it became working on something that I was really passionate about. And my fitness company is really successful, and it's still really successful. We've transformed thousands of lives. And Bitcoin for me is something similar to that. That as I started to understand Bitcoin, I became really passionate about it. And then of course with my sort of entrepreneurial streak, I was like, well, why not build a business around it like I did with fitness? Because I was only talking about something that you're really passionate about, something that's had a great effect on your life, and you're just going to share the benefits. And you can do it as a job, so it's win-win. I like to start with, inflation is hot right now, that a lot of people are talking about it or feeling it. And as Bitcoiners have been talking about inflation a lot. That's sort of the reason for Bitcoin, or one of the reasons, there are many. And like an accurate inflation rate is probably around 15%. And if our pensions are only returning 6%, they're underwater. But what I like to say to people is, especially people who are newer, that since Bitcoin started to its high, okay, it's up over 60 million%. So it's like the highest performing thing ever. And then I'm like, well, why don't more people own it? And it's just that it has this bad reputation, or, in my workshops I'll always say, mainstream media has kept people poor for a decade. And even when I made my slides a couple of years ago, I still have it that FUD. There's always going to be FUD, and it's the exact same now, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's why I think it's good to come to in-person events, and rather than just reading clickbait headlines, it can be really misleading, and actually go and do a little bit of the work for yourself on Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin? Some of you know it, and I think we all know it really differently. I think as you learn, your understanding evolves, and mine is continually evolving, and every year, it's sort of, my understanding of it changes ever so slightly. Your understanding of it changes, but I like the baby step when I'm trying to explain it to people is digital gold. That was an easy step for me to get over that hurdle. Because on the internet, it's one of the great things of the internet, there's so much information, but then it can be one of the limiting things that when you're coming at something trying to learn it, and there's so much information, you can get lost, you can get diluted, you can go down the wrong avenues. So, Bitcoin is money because it fits sort of the characteristics of money, and it's operating as a money. Not to everybody, but for some people in the world, they treat it as a money, it's their money. And it's obviously an investment asset, because it's not a sure thing. There's a speculative element to it. It's a digital property. That was the invention, sort of as I understand it, that Bitcoin allowed property rights within the digital world, okay? And it's also a currency, although we always get hung up with it being a currency. And people, well, I can't buy a coffee with it, I can't buy this. And again, sometimes it's just funny, but you can't buy coffee with Tesla stock, or you can't buy coffee with an ounce of gold. But that's not why you own it. But it is all of those things, to me, and I think as your understanding changes, we're all at different stages of our journey, how we process it. But tonight, my talk is sort of to try and a little bit of a basics to help people start their journey. So I stick with the digital gold. narrative. And like, what is money? Anyone's ever seen me with my gold coin? I don't know how I haven't lost it yet, because I'm always carrying around with me. But money is gold, and it's been money for thousands of years. And you need certain characteristics for something to be a money, and it's not a currency. There's a slight difference between a money and a currency. I think you can save in a money, but you can't save in a currency. A currency is like a euro, or a pound, or a dollar. But a currency will go down in value over time. And that's where I went wrong for the first half of my life. Before I started to invest, I used to save currency, trying to get rich. And as I explained that now, it's like trying to fill a bucket full of water with a big hole in the bottom. And when you get the bucket full of water, that's financial freedom. You can give up work. But currency, the energy is leaking out of it constantly. But the money you can save in. What makes gold and money is it's durable. And it just means it can't be destroyed. Like, gold is difficult to destroy or impossible to destroy. They say all the gold ever mined is still in existence today. 2 Olympic-sized swim pools. This little lad just fits in there as part of it. Okay? It's portable, I can move it. That was one of the problems with gold, though, and why we sort of faded off gold, because of the portability, the weight issue of it. Can't remember the statistic, but I think you lose like maybe 1 to 0.5% of gold every time you have to move it. You know, so if you move it, whatever, 100 times, it's cost you the value of the gold. And as the world got more interconnected, that didn't suit our modern world. Divisibility, gold's divisible. You know, you can have an ounce, you can have 2 ounces, you can have a kilo. Fungibility, just like for like. Humans aren't fungible. You can't go home and get into bed with your friend's wife. You know, that's what fungibility is. Okay? So humans aren't fungible. You can try it. Okay? Recognizability. And money has to be recognizable, you know, so humans can use it and trust it. Gold does have some problems with recognizability because technology is better now. You know, so we can fake gold. You know, so it's harder now. If I bring this to the bullion dealer, he'll do a lot of tests on it to make sure it's not just, I didn't buy it on Amazon for 20 quid. And the most important characteristic, I think, of something to be a good money is that it must be scarce and difficult to produce. And that sort of allows gold to be a store of value, and it's worked as a store of value for thousands of years. So to me, Bitcoin is just dematerialized gold. It's just a digital version of this physical coin. And when I sort of look at the characteristics of gold and of Bitcoin, is Bitcoin durable? Well, it's digital, so it doesn't exist in the physical world. So it doesn't have all the problems of the physical world. It doesn't wear out. Okay, it doesn't suffer from Newtonian physics. It's just a software. So it's insanely durable. Is Bitcoin portable? Bitcoin solves the portability issues of gold because Bitcoin's insanely portable. If I have €1 million worth of gold and I want to move it to Singapore, I'm heading down there. Probably a bad example, I wouldn't go there, I don't think there's any surf. But if I was, with my €1 million worth of gold, I could transport it down there to a vault. It would take weeks and it would cost me tens of thousands and it'd be a pain in the ass of paperwork. If I have €1 million worth in Bitcoin, I can send it down there to a custodian pretty much while I'm chatting to you guys with my phone in my hand. And it doesn't cost tens of thousands, it costs me maybe 2 quid. So Bitcoin's insanely portable and divisible. I have my gold coin here. If ever I need to sell it, I have to sell it. It's worth, I think, 1,700 quid. But if I have 1,700 quid's worth, or euros worth, of Bitcoin, I can sell a penny's worth. Or I can fractionalize it any way I want, I can break it up. So it's very divisible. Fungible just means like for like. Every Bitcoin, every Satoshi has fungibility. It just means you don't need an individual one of them. Anyone will do. You can swap one for the other. Okay? Recognizable. Again, this is, I think, a problem that Bitcoin solves that gold couldn't solve in today's world. I can exchange a good or service with anyone, anywhere in the world if I don't know them or I don't trust them. And once that Bitcoin lands in my wallet, it's verified through Bitcoin, because the Bitcoin network is the largest supercomputer in the world. So there's no chargebacks. Bitcoin works like cash in the digital world. It's like if I, and like gold works as well, if I walk up and hand my gold coin to Mark, I'm not going to, you're not getting it, all right? But once I hand that to Mark, that's a final transaction. Mark has the gold now, okay? But previous to that, on the online world, we couldn't do that. We always had to go through. We never had a cash economy in the digital world. But we can with Bitcoin. And because of the recognizability, the Bitcoin network accepting the transaction, you know, I'm not going to get my wallet, get a phone call from someone from Bitcoin, which there is no one from Bitcoin, ringing me up and going, Dinny, sorry, they were fake Bitcoins you got sent. Oops. But like that can happen in the regular system. And the scarcity was the first thing I learned about Bitcoin. The first thing I learned about Bitcoin was that there was only 21 million. And that got me interested because I'm an entrepreneur and I understand scarcity. Like when I'm in business, you understand that if you're the only person in the town doing a certain business, you have an amazing business. And if you're doing amazing, well, everyone starts doing it. And then business isn't as good anymore because your customer base is diluted. So scarcity and value are really, really correlated. And when I learned there was only 21 million Bitcoin, and I've been hearing about it for such a long time, it was like, well, it's ultimately scarce. But Bitcoin improves upon scarcity because Bitcoin is finite. And like I jokingly say that the only two things in the world that are finite are your time on the planet. You know, you only have what you have. When you're in the box, it's game over in this life. And Bitcoin, because you can't make any more. Everything else, if humans or entrepreneurs are incentivized to make more of it, we can. And as the value of something goes up, like my example in the business, I'll tell you a little story. When I started off my fitness business, I was doing kettlebells. Used to be doing them in a PE hall, sometimes with 80 people, spending a tenner a head. And I was doing it for 45 minutes work. Like, that was a good little business. And I was the only personal trainer in sorts doing it. But then a few people started to notice. Then a few more people started to do it. And then the scarcity was gone out of that business because everyone was a kettlebell instructor in the whole of Ireland. Okay? But with Bitcoin, it's finite. It doesn't matter how many people want Bitcoin, there still can be no more than 21 million. It doesn't matter how many people try and mine Bitcoin, and Mark will be giving us a good understanding of mining, but it doesn't create Bitcoins any faster. And that's something that, you know, to me, is really valuable. When you understand gold, you understand scarcity, and you understand currency debasement or expansion, you know, as we're seeing with our euros, the purchasing power of them has just gone down and down and down. It always has, it always will. But it's accelerated in the last 2 years. And that's why owning something that's, you know, similar to gold, but an improvement on gold, I see a lot of value in that. Everything in this picture is in your pocket. So this is what I'm talking for a little bit about, because if it's digital gold, well, does that matter? Does dematerialization matter? Bitcoin is dematerialized gold, is how I like to use the first step to understand it. Because it shares all the characteristics of gold, but it just doesn't have the physicality. You can hold gold in your hand. In Bitcoin, you can hold it on a wallet, but technically it doesn't really exist in the physical. But a lot of things in our life have been dematerialized, and I'd like to give just a few examples. Music was dematerialized. And I used to have my Discman, I'd go for my jogs, and the CD gets scratched, and I'd have to buy the same music again, same CD again, that I'd already bought, and I only had 12 songs on it. And then we dematerialized it, so we can't hold our music in our hand anymore. But we don't have any of the problems of the physical. With the digital, we can do so much more. So rather than just getting 12 songs, I have, I don't know, how many songs are there in the world? You know, Spotify, you can't listen to all that stuff ever. There's everything you want to listen to. And podcasts, and all sorts of stuff. So the digital is not just a little bit better, it's not just a digital version of it, it's orders of magnitude better, it's much better. And that's why these don't exist anymore. Another example I like is, you know, filing cabinets, those steel yokes. Like, they don't exist because we have the cloud. Or Michael Saylor, who explains this stuff a lot better than me, but he'll talk about maps. You know, and I remember as a kid going away on holidays and being roused with Dad with the map in the car getting lost. But now we don't need that, because you can just have it on one little bit of hardware, you know, on your mobile phone. So the world is being dematerialized. And software has taken over a lot of aspects of our life. It already has. And I think it's naive maybe to think that it's not going to happen to money. Now, there is a thinking that, and I think it's like thinking in the past, and it's, you know, holding it in my hand is a good thing. Or it being physical is a good thing. But I think that's thinking in the past or the present. The future thinking is holding it in my hand is a bad thing. Can we not make this digital? Because anything we make digital is generally a lot better. A story that I like to give about software taking over is the story of Blockbuster and Netflix. So when Blockbuster, not too long ago, had a monopoly on media streaming, and their business model was in the physical world. It was people want physical product, DVDs, they want to buy them, they want to come home from our store, put them on their shelf, give them a loan to their friends, have the physical product. And they had a monopoly on the whole industry in that they had chains all over the world and they were so well capitalized that anyone who got any traction in that industry, they just bought them out or they crushed them. And then there was a startup called Netflix, and they had a different idea. They were like, we don't need the physical. What we can do is, instead of having physical stores, instead of having physical products, we can dematerialize all this stuff. We can host it on one platform. It's going to be so much cheaper. The customers are going to love it. And Blockbuster were obviously thinking in the, if I can't hold it, it's a bad thing. And they were like, none of our customers are going to value that. That's not a legitimate business. People want to come to our stores and hold our product. But how the story played out is, a couple of short years later, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. Because the world realised that dematerialised media is much better. And Netflix became one of the biggest companies in the world, not just as big as Blockbuster, because their product is so much better. Humanity only moves towards technology, except Peter Schiff. We'll talk about him in a second. He's a genius. A marketing genius. Gold has a market cap of 10 trillion, because the question with Bitcoin is it too late? And one of my best mentors, I've learned from a lot of great people in the space, and I still learn from loads of great people in the space. It's amazing. But Simon Dixon was an amazing mentor, and Simon talked to me one day, just a couple of short years ago, and he said in 2014 people were saying it was too late for Bitcoin. And he said in 2017 people were saying it was too late for Bitcoin. And this was in 2020. He said people would be saying it's too late for Bitcoin. And he said 2025 people would be saying it's too late for Bitcoin. Because when you really understand Bitcoin, you'll understand that it's never too late to understand Bitcoin. And I think the boys will explain this a little bit better than me. But we can speculate on the price of Bitcoin. It's interesting, it's fun, but really Bitcoin doesn't have a top. But anyway, if we want to just have a look at it compared to other assets. Gold, where's my coin? Did I lose it? No, boom. Gold's market cap is about 10 trillion, and I think that's what Bitcoin is. It's one of its targets. Bitcoin has many targets, not just digital gold. There's loads of stuff that Bitcoin is eating into. But gold is the first easy one. And gold is valued at 10 trillion, and Bitcoin is 0.5 of a trillion at the minute. If Bitcoin was to become digital gold, as Netflix became digital Blockbuster, well, one Bitcoin is valued at 500k per coin. So at $30,000 today, there's a lot of upside in saving in Bitcoin. But it doesn't even have to. I think the step with Bitcoin is, can you understand that something digital has value? That's the hurdle. If you can get over, can I hold it in my hand? And you'll need to get over that, because that's the way the world has gone and going. And I think it's irrelevant whether us as a single individual can make that step, because the generations behind me and my nephews and that, they're already there. They don't want bicycles, they don't want physical presents anymore. They want digital presents. They don't want to be able to hold stuff in their hand. They prefer if there's a digital version. So that's the world we move into. And another example I like to give is, just on Peter Schiff, he's a gold guy, and he's very incentivized to sort of bash Bitcoin, and he's a genius, because he gets amazing PR and marketing from it. And he owns a lot of gold bars. But he has a son called Spencer, and his son is in his 20s, and typical, a kid of digital age, he owns no gold bars, he's not interested in gold. Bitcoin is his gold. So I think it's fairly easy to see what happens there. When Peter, the father, eventually dies, what happens to the gold bars when Spencer inherits them? He doesn't like the fact he can hold them in his hand. That's not an advantage, that's a disadvantage. He converts them to the digital gold. And that eventually just happens all throughout the world. Over I don't know the timeline, a period of years, decades, but I see it as an inevitability that it happens, because that's the world that's coming behind us. Every year we live more on the internet, we use more digital, never less. Humans only move towards technology. And maybe it's a little bit bigger than just gold, which I think Bitcoin is, but I think Bitcoin being digital gold is the first step to try and get your head around. And for me, I spent a lot of time on that initially, and then I moved on. I think humans have, three basic needs. Everyone has. We need food to survive. We need shelter. But now that we're a little more civilized, we need an ability to save. Okay? And our ability to save, at the moment, it's really compromised, especially now. It's like, what do you do with your euros? The first half of my life, when I didn't understand this, I used to save euros. And now where I am in my life, I'm like, as soon as you get euros, you want to get rid of them. And that's how broke the money is that the worst thing you can hold is your money. I say to people, like, get your money and buy toilet paper, because in 5 years, it's going to be more expensive. Then you can sell the toilet paper and have more money. That's crazy, like. But that's the system we live in. So we don't have an ability to save anymore. And that's the biggest problem that Bitcoin solves, is because it's a fixed money supply. There's only 21 million. It can't be diluted, it can't be debased. Fair enough, we're early in its issuance, so all the coins haven't been mined. Does anyone know how many Bitcoin are in circulation at the moment?
18, 19?
Yeah, somewhere around 18, 19 million. I think 19 million clicked there recently. So there's only 2 million coins to be mined. Now that's good if you're going to choose to invest into Bitcoin today, I think, because the majority of the coins that come into the market have been mined. Does anyone know how long it'll take to mine the last 2 million? Yeah, 2140. We'll all be dead. Unfortunately. I don't know. Maybe Lawrence's young lad there might make it. He's only starting, yeah. Well, we don't know. Medicine is getting better, but likely we're not going to see the last Bitcoin mined. But what Bitcoin solves is how we currently save. I think first half of my life I saved in cash, and I could never get ahead. I was living in a mobile home. Then as I developed and became an entrepreneur and I learned about businesses, you start to invest into other asset classes. But basically, invest just means save. Invest is like, well, if I do nothing with my money, I'm guaranteed to lose it over time. So I have to speculate with my money, because my money isn't good money. Good money should store value, but euros aren't storing value. So I have to push it out. And a lot of the time you have to give it away to someone else. And I remember it was when I was living in my mobile home, because I'd read books on how to get rich, how to invest, And I rang a financial advisor. And I was like, what's the crack? Yeah, I want to invest. Yeah, no problem, sir. How much have you got? 30 euros a month. It's just tumbleweed on the phone. And that's one of the reasons why I'm passionate about Bitcoin. Because you can start investing with Bitcoin. There's no barrier to entry. You can start investing into Bitcoin or saving in Bitcoin with a $5 a week or whatever you got. There's no minimum, oh, we're not interested in you. But some of the asset classes, there is a barrier to entry, like property. You already need to have a lot of capital to be able to get into that asset class. So it rules out a lot of people. And all these other asset classes, like the stock market or commodities and that, they're just ways that people are trying to keep the money. You exchange your time for money. We all do that, okay? But so we don't lose that money over time, we have to go and gamble with it. Whether it's on stocks or whether it's on Bitcoin. But we have to take on an element of risk, because we know without risk, we're going to lose the money slowly. But Bitcoin solves the problem, I think, as an ability to save. I think of Bitcoin as a long-term savings vehicle. Okay, a speculative long-term savings vehicle. It's not 100% certainty. Some people might argue that. Okay, but it's a speculative long-term savings vehicle, and it's got such asymmetry, meaning so much upside, but not as much downside, that it's almost a no-brainer that you should speculate a small portion of your savings, which is money that you don't need to put your hand on. Savings aren't money that you might need tomorrow. Savings are, well, I don't need that for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or forever. I just want to protect that money. And that's what I think of Bitcoin as. That's the best place for that money. Because And nearly every week in consulting, I get someone who's sold a property, a physical property they can hold. Remember that problem? I can't hold Bitcoin, so it's a bad thing, but because the property is physical, they have to deal with people wanting it painted. The light's not working, the washing machine's leaking, the neighbours are making loads of noise. And they've got 300, 400 grand tied up in it. When they pay all their tax on it, they're putting 200 quid a week in their pocket. Or a month, sometimes. They're ditching the physical, and they're going, well, I can just own the digital property. I don't have to paint it, I don't do anything to it. All I have to do is just own it, and keep it safe. And that's it. I don't have to work to make it more valuable. Other people are building onto Bitcoin. By owning Bitcoin, other people are building onto it and making it more valuable. It's like owning the internet. Everything that's built on the internet now makes it more valuable. All the applications, all the companies. Okay? And owning Bitcoin is like owning a portion of the internet. But as I see Bitcoin I see it as a solution to savings technology. And hopefully over my lifetime I see it realised that it becomes the vehicle of choice to save in. Because it's certainly easier. I don't have to go into the stock market and try and understand all that stuff. Okay? If I'm a car mechanic or a doctor or whatever my trade or job is, I just want to exchange my time, do my trade, I put my money in something where I know it's going to be there in 10 years for my family, or 20 years, or 30 years. I don't have to try and pick stocks and understand when I need to trade in and out of stuff, and what's a good company and what's a bad company. Or the same with property, not sure if the property market's going to crash, or if someone's going to wreck the gaff or not pay and all the hassle, just so I can keep my money. Bitcoin's so easy, I just buy Bitcoin, and I do nothing. And it's almost too easy, and I think that's sometimes the irony of why we struggle. We need to make it more complicated. And all the other asset classes, I think Rich is going to go into this a little bit as well, so I won't spend too long on it. But Bitcoin is a better store of value than everything else, because we can build more houses. Can't make more than 21 million Bitcoin. And it's a built system of scarcity. And then just for fun, because it is good to play with numbers, and give yourself a little bit of positivity. And that's one thing that Bitcoin brings to people, is positivity for the future. And you don't have to worry about your future. But if Bitcoin is a better store of value than all of these assets, and this asset class is valued at 400 trillion, there's loads of knots there. You can Google them, I'm not sure if I got enough. All right? But this thing is 0.5 of a trillion. What if this is like Blockbuster? And this is little Netflix. And here we all have the opportunity to take part, in the digitization of saving, and going from physical savings that you can hold your savings to a digital version. And that's sort of what I see the opportunity in Bitcoin. Just for fun, can anyone do them maths in their head? Let's say if half of the world never, it can't happen, but just for fun, we say only half of the world wants a digital version. Half of them want to keep their records on their CDs. Anyone know what the price of a Bitcoin would be? If 200 trillion of that sort of collapsed into Bitcoin. Well, it won't collapse into it. Bitcoin will suck it out of it into Bitcoin. 10 million. And it's just maths. You just divide it by 21 million. And as you guys know, if you follow me, I needed a calculator to do that. But, and look at the irony, you still can't buy a coffee with it. What your friends will tell you, that's why Bitcoin's crap, because you can't buy something with it. I don't need to buy a coffee with it. Buy a coffee with my currency, that's what currency is for. And again, it's just sort of playing with numbers, but, I'm a massive Bitcoin bull. I really think it's amazing technology. I think not only will it make me rich, whatever, I don't have to worry about money, but I think it's good for the world. The world needs it. It will change our civilization for the better, I think. And, and that's what I'm passionate about, being able to do something that I really am passionate about. As a little job, it's awesome. Shameless plug, Crypto With Dinny will help you retire early. Book into our consultation if you need help to understand it. If you're starting your journey, we do education, we help you set up your wallets, wherever you are on your journey, or to help you set up, what I call a retirement plan B. You can have your regular retirement plan, go at it for 40 years, get your few quid. But I think a retirement plan B, it's so little risk, with such small investment, it's just like insurance, just in case Bitcoin sucks the life out of everything, as it has been doing. for the last 13 years. It's just, everything is bleeding into it. And I don't see that stopping just by understanding how technologies evolve and that they don't go backwards. And do your bit, I always say, to spread the Bitcoin love. Like, Bitcoin is a bottoms-up movement. Bitcoin is people's money. It gives you power back in your spending. It gives you power back in your money. It's not attached to any country or political party. It's just fully neutral money, and it's perfect money once you understand it. And I know it's very volatile at the start, and it can be difficult, and that's why education is really important. And trying to get to things. And once you start to learn, once Bitcoin has done you good, or you understand it, or if it's even helped you feel better about your future, I think it's your duty, to teach other people. Because Bitcoin's going to take people to drive it on. I'm not just assuming that it drives itself on. It probably does. But why not help other people along the way? And, as we say, share the Bitcoin love. Obviously, being the entrepreneur, lads, I have a special offer. Well, I have a mic in my hand. But I did a special offer. I only done this there, slipped it in. Bitcoin, capital letters, on the Crypto With Dinny website, gives you 50 quid off everything we do. We have a boot camp on Saturday. It'll teach you everything you need to do to retire early. We have consulting. The offer runs until Saturday. And that's a bit of a subliminal messaging there. Guys, thank you. Give us a subscribe on the podcast.
So I've, from a traditional sense, I have a degree in financial maths and actuarial sciences, but I suppose from the importance of today, I've been involved in the crypto space, I suppose at the beginning, since 2019, and as a result, over the course of the past 3 years, I've kind of built up my own understanding, and through that understanding I've been able to meet some interesting people, one of whom is an individual who reached out to me about 2 years ago and wanted to start an Irish-based Bitcoin business. And I suppose what we did is we sat down and we knew we wanted to do something Bitcoin related, but of course, given the size of the space, it's not always easy to make a decision very quickly. And so we explored a lot of ideas. We wanted to start a fund, we wanted to do custody, and all those things were fine, but the conclusion we always inevitably came to is that a lot of the traditional businesses that we see today are just going to do that anyway. And also one critical factor that we wanted is we wanted to accrue as much Bitcoin as we possibly could. And the conclusion that we inevitably came to is that the best accumulators of Bitcoin in the world are miners. And so, first of all, the first decision was, okay, we're going to be miners, so how can we make it work? And obviously both being from Cork, and our whole team being from Cork and Ireland, we wanted to be miners, we wanted to make it work in Ireland, so we went down a long rabbit hole of trying to understand how can we be a miner and how can we make it work in Ireland. And of course, the first thing we saw was our electricity prices and said, there's no real hope that we're going to make it happen here, we're going to have to go elsewhere. But we stuck at it, and eventually we arrived at Skilling Digital Mining, which is our business that we're currently running. So a bit of an introduction today. It's good to see so many people here, given the price of Bitcoin over the past few months. I feel like people have a lot of energy to spend on Bitcoin, but they spend it all on looking at the price, and inevitably they get brought along on this kind of roller coaster over a couple of months, and eventually they become fed up with it, or become annoyed, or become upset about it. And they ultimately leave the space without ever really understanding that it's not just, an investment vehicle. There's actually a pretty incredible network built underneath that a lot of people walk away and they never know about, they never learn about, they never really see what it could possibly be. So I suppose getting into my perspective on it and what's important to me about Bitcoin is it's an energy asset. And so that's my focus of the talk today, which is to showcase that as much as you hear about it being just an investment, it's a lot more than that. And what Skilling Digital Mining focuses on is how can Bitcoin mining be used as an energy asset as well. So I suppose some of the key takeaways that I want people to kind of learn today is understanding mining kind of from start to finish, how that all works, how it applies to real world energy applications, and then how can you take what you learned today away, and when you're reading traditional articles which shows some of these headlines kind of over the past couple of years, which was in 2017 that by 2020 that Bitcoin mining was going to be using all of the world's energy. Clearly that didn't materialize. And a few other ones that like to catch a lot of attention, but when you kind of really dig into the figures, they don't quite add up, or they need to be contextualized. So to kick things off, I suppose, what is Bitcoin mining? How does it actually work? And what's the purpose of it from a Bitcoin perspective? And the main one is just issue Bitcoin and have that steady issuance of Bitcoin over time. And the second one is to process transactions. And so what's the use of Bitcoin mine? You know, you hear a lot about it. When I was telling my buddies after I finished college that I was going into Bitcoin mining, they kind of said, oh yeah, you're getting a pickaxe and a hard hat, and where are you going to find it? You know, that's kind of the first reaction. I said, no, it's not like that. And they said, oh, well, I assume you probably have to have a degree in computer science to do it so, because obviously it's quite difficult. And when I told them that it was machines, they couldn't really quite believe it. And so the word you hear used to describe how the mining process works is it's done by ASICs, which is just application-specific integrated circuits, which is basically a fancy word for what these two things on the table are here. So you have two of them there in front of you. You have what's basically a brand new S19, which is 100 terahashes, which basically means that it fires 100 trillion guesses a second, and we'll get into how all that works in a few slides' time. And next to it you have an E-Bang, which is, believe it or not, probably only 2 and a bit years apart from when that small one was released and when the new one was released. And that E-Bang does 9 trillion guesses a second, and the one next to it does 100 trillion guesses a second. So you can kind of see just in that 2-year time frame how the technology is evolving. And so ASICs are obviously a crucial part of the mining process, but two other really crucial parts of this are obviously understanding hash rate, understanding network difficulty, and the halving. And so while they're, you know, a physical aspect of it, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to kind of keep this mining process ticking along as it should. You know, the kind of saying is tick tock next block, which is no matter what's going on in Bitcoin, it'll keep producing a new block every 10 minutes. And so what hash rate actually means is that these machines are producing guesses, and they're called hashes. All the global hash rate is how many of these machines are firing guesses at the blockchain at any given moment. And someone might ask, you know, if you brought a lot of these machines online and you have double the amount of machines mining, surely all the Bitcoin will be mined over the course of the next 5 years. But that isn't the case, because Bitcoin has a built-in algorithm that every 2016 blocks you have a thing called a network difficulty adjustment, which is if the blocks aren't being produced every 10 minutes, it'll look back over the past 2016 blocks and say, was it 10.5 minutes on average? Right, we need to make it a bit easier to mine. Or was it much faster? So, you know, recently there's been a lot of machines coming online from publicly listed miners, which means the blocks have been mined every about 9 or so minutes. And as a result, it's becoming increasingly difficult every 2016 blocks to mine. But as of today, given the recent drawdown in price, a few machines are now unprofitable, and they've come offline, and as a result we had a downward network difficulty change this morning, which means it just becomes slightly easier for those who can stay on. And of course then we have kind of this crucial halving, which is the deflationary aspect of Bitcoin, which is this idea of every 210,000 blocks, the reward that's given to the miners who help to mine the block halves. So at the moment we're at 6.25. I watched the last one when it went from 12.5, and it's as simple as when we hit that 210,000 block, the reward from every block onwards was half what it was previously. And so this is just to visualize a block, because I think it helps, because a lot of this can kind of sound quite difficult to understand, but especially when you say that it helps to process the transactions. But this is actually what you kind of see in the inner workings of a block. So if myself and Dinny were to send Bitcoin back and forth, we'd be one of these small orange blocks here. Okay, let's read. And all that's happening is that these are small transactions that are occurring. They're going into basically a waiting area called the mempool. And when a block appears, all the transactions that are waiting to be processed are put into the block or embedded in the block. And when it's mined, they're processed. And so how does this actually look? You know, that's a focus in on one block specifically, but how does the blockchain actually look when all of this is occurring? And so I like to kind of think of it as a conveyor belt. So you can't go on to the next block until the previous one is mined. So all of these purple blocks here have been mined already. And what essentially the process of mining actually means when I say that these machines are firing guesses is that you can't see it right now, but that block there, that first green one, has a header at the top. And that block basically has a combination code that needs to be solved before it can be added in with the rest of them. And all these machines are doing is firing guesses at that block, trying to guess that combination code. So there's an inherently wrong assumption that's always listed in kind of the traditional explanations of mining, that these machines are solving complex equations, and it's completely wrong. Because when I first started and I read that, what I assumed is that if this small machine wins the block, we're going to be waiting all day for it to mine it, because it's an older machine, it can't move as fast, but it's nothing like that. It's actually just a lottery. So if that small machine there fires the correct guess and guesses that combination code, we're on to the next block straight away. And so this assumption that, oh, the older machines, that if it's the one that wins the block, we're going to be waiting all day, it's nothing like that. It's always just a game of chance. And those machines fire guesses similarly, it's just that one fires more than the other, but they can win it just the same. And so what happens is when this block is guessed correctly by any machine, it's then added to the Bitcoin blockchain. But one thing that's actually spawned from the idea of mining is that if I was to turn on that brand new S19 there, which for a while was kind of retailing at $10,000 a machine, I could leave that machine run and solo mine, in quotes, and it could take 27 years on average before it actually hits a block or finds anything. And I suppose what the risk you can take is that I could turn this on for a year, and in the morning I could wake up to 6.25 Bitcoin. But in reality, the likelihood of that happening is so small. What's actually spawned from that is mining pools. And what they do is they take thousands of machines' guesses together and they basically forward them on. And the reason mining pools have become so important is for businesses that are trying to model revenue. And so instead of me winning one block, which basically means my machine sitting right there fired that correct combination code for any given block, the pool wins the block. And as a result, just because my machine doesn't win, if another machine in the pool wins, then the reward is shared amongst everyone in the pool. So you can look back and I might say that that machine actually won, but because I'm a part of slush pool, which is this mining pool, I have to share my reward with everyone else. But what that means is that instead of winning one block every 20 or so years, you might win 10 blocks a day, and as a result then you're just getting your pro rata share of how many guesses you were sending. And so that machine there, as I said earlier, is 100 terahashes, which is firing 100 trillion guesses a second. And the idea is if there was 500 terahashes in the pool, and that pool wins, I would get 20% of that block reward, which is the 6.25 Bitcoin at the moment. But in reality, there's about 200,000 workers in the slush pool, so whenever we win a block, I can go onto our slush pool and I might just see 0.002 Bitcoin, 0.002 Bitcoin, but that might happen 9 or 10 times a day. And for a business like ourselves at Skilling, it helps us to model our revenues, as instead of waiting years and years and never knowing, we're hitting about 9, 10 blocks a day. And it's never constant, because as I said, it's a game of chance at the end of the day. But what you're doing by being part of the pool is some days you get 15 blocks, some days you get 5 blocks, and all in all, you're smoothing out those revenue curves, so that at least you can have a reasonable estimate of what you'll make over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. And so what spawned from this idea of Bitcoin mining is this constant, energy debate, which is where is Bitcoin mining worth it, and should we be doing it at all? And I suppose from a Bitcoiner perspective, I do think it's worth it because I value Bitcoin, and I think that something people overlook a lot with blockchain is that there's this constant narrative at the moment that everything should be put on a blockchain. And there's very little understanding that if you don't have protection for that blockchain, it's as weak as anything else. So there's an assumption that if you put something on a blockchain, it's instantly secure. Is just inherently wrong. You may as well put it on a traditional database. But I suppose what makes Bitcoin secure is that this whole proof of work process is that you have thousands of these machines that took capex from an individual in order to put there. And so if you were to try attack this network, you'd probably need about $16 billion worth of capital in order to buy all the machines, in order to attack the network, and then you'd also need to be able to build a data center big enough to house all the machines. And that's where the protection comes from. So people say, oh, you need to put everything on blockchain, shipping and flights. If you don't have something that incentivizes you to protect the blockchain or maintain that chain of truth, which is essentially what a blockchain is, then there's no incentive to keep it safe at all. And anyone who wants to behave as a bad actor can do so. And so what all this energy is doing is it's protecting the Bitcoin network. But I suppose aside from the Bitcoin part of my brain that's saying, we need this energy, proof of work is the most secure, and anything else may as well be put on a traditional database, I think for today, to make it actually meaningful for everyone that's here, we should play devil's advocate and assume that, from my perspective, Bitcoin itself isn't worth it. And so how can we use proof of work and Bitcoin mining in a meaningful and positive way to actually make a difference? And then I'll leave the Bitcoin specific things to Dinny and Rich. And so the kind of first thing that I feel like we need to do in order to kind of understand how Bitcoin can have a positive and meaningful impact is just have a bit of a background on energy itself. And I said I'd focus on the Irish grid system because that's why we're here. You know, we spend all our time looking at other countries moving in the right direction with Bitcoin and mining, but we don't really hear much about it here. And so I thought we might focus on that just for today. So EirGrid is the individual that operates EirGrid and helps energy that's produced get from wherever it's produced to your home. But like any system, it has its faults. And so a key aspect of us having a heavily renewable grid is that we have a thing called dispatch down, which is basically where EirGrid can take the energy that's being produced. And it's for two key reasons. So one of them is constraint. And the best way that I would like to describe constraint is that, say, in the west of Ireland, you have these turbines with the wind coming off the west coast that's producing Dublin rush hour traffic worth of energy. And it's trying to get on basically Kerry back roads to where it needs to go. And the roads themselves physically can't take that much traffic. And so as a result, those renewable sites are asked to turn down because the grid can't take it in that specific area. And a second one that's probably less well known is curtailment, which is where our grid system actually has a heartbeat, and so our grid needs to operate at 50 hertz. But if the supply and demand of energy starts to move, if we have too little supply, that heartbeat drops, and if we have too much supply, that heartbeat goes too fast. And so there's constant mechanisms that are at play that we don't even realise when we're sitting in our homes in order to keep our grid balanced and to keep the lights on. And so the key thing for me is trying to explain how Bitcoin mining will actually integrate with that. And one aspect of it is off-grid and one aspect of it is on-grid. And so in order to build that understanding, I suppose the next best thing to do is kind of show what we're doing at Skilling Digital Mining, which is over the course of the past 2 years, we feel like there's a market for containerized Bitcoin solutions, which is where you can drop Bitcoin mining into a case that's having this restriction of energy and offer what's basically called in the industry a buyer of last resort. And I'll go through multiple models, but what the joy of this model is that you can basically drop, so this container, and this isn't all hypothetical because this container is going to an anaerobic digestion site tomorrow morning. This is our first large-scale container, so at 6 a.m. tomorrow, we're packing up this container and we're dropping it next to an anaerobic digestion site in Armagh. And if people are looking at me talking about anaerobic digestion, saying, what is that? All it essentially is a large tank that you put farm and food waste into, and as it decomposes, you get methane or biogas. And I'll get into the opportunities that they present, but I suppose firstly, just looking at what Skilling does itself is that we've spent a long time perfecting this model, and all these containers do is you drop them on the site and they offer you a buyer of last resort or a sponge for your excess energy. But another really important factor is that it gives you a perfect, unfussy buyer that can sit off-grid and consume any excess energy that's there. So while it can act as a sponge, with the grid or without the grid, the key aspect is that there are sites around the country that have energy to produce that they can't put on the grid, and they just need a sponge that will use it and produce revenue. And so that's kind of what we've been working toward. So, what examples are there of this that will actually benefit from this off-grid solution? So the first one is wind. And as I mentioned earlier about constraint, there's sites around the country, wind sites that are being asked to shut down, and what you can do is you can drop these containers full of miners, and whenever the wind production is asked to taper off or to turn down, instead of tapering off or turning down, what you do is you funnel it through these containers that are filled with these ASICs. As a result, then you're monetizing the excess energy. Instead of wasting it, you're essentially turning it into money, which is essentially that for every block that we win, we'll be getting sent our Bitcoin, and if that individual likes Bitcoin, they can keep it or they can turn it into cash. But there's actually a lot more uses than just wind, and so a really interesting one that we've kind of come across as we've been kind of building this model over the past 2 years is that anaerobic digestion is becoming increasingly popular, but where anaerobic digestion could be most meaningful, and as I said earlier, it's literally just a tank that allows farm and food waste to decompose and you get biogas, is that what they want to do is they would love to have these mini anaerobic digesters on every farm in the country. As obviously, if you've been seeing some of the news, that the agricultural sector has been getting a lot of grief for methane emissions, but there's no financial incentive for them to actually do anything about it. And so what they've been doing is coming up with small-scale anaerobic digesters that they can put on site that would use up their farm and food waste or whatever they might have. But farmers, are looking at them saying, what's the financial incentive for me to buy this small-scale AD? I'm not going to be able to pay it back. Or what you're proposing to me is that I'll go get a grid connection here to send 50 kilowatts back to the grid. and I'm going to have to deal with the ESB, which will take a couple of months, if not years. It's going to be extremely costly, and ultimately I don't see how I'm going to pay back this small-scale anaerobic digester. And what we've kind of found is that what they're really looking for is a buyer of that energy that can actually give them a return. And so what we see it being a perfect pairing with Bitcoin mining is that you take these small-scale anaerobic digesters and you forget about the grid. The grid is essentially now worthless to them. What they can do is they can take this containerized solution and they can put it next to these small-scale anaerobic digesters and make a perfectly closed system that then just buys all the energy that small-scale anaerobic digester creates. And now they have this unfussy, constant buyer of energy without ever needing to go to the grid or sell it to the grid. And that's what Bitcoin mining offers, is this perfect buyer of last resort, which is kind of the concept that we keep going back to. And that's kind of where we would like to see the kind of Irish mining market going, especially given everything that's been mentioned in agriculture at the moment and about their emissions and all the grief that they're getting. Is people assume that Bitcoin is this constant pollutant that's always running, and if we ever send money back and forth, that an oil and gas generator has been turned on somewhere. But in reality, transactions themselves use absolutely no energy, and the Bitcoin mining process can be used in kind of innovative ways to reduce emissions. And so instead of now the farm waste or food waste decomposing outside, like they're kind of doing at the moment, and letting the emissions go into the atmosphere, they now have this perfectly closed system that's taking in the food and farm waste, and it's actually giving them a return that's meaningful, and they can finally pay back that small-scale anaerobic digester. And I suppose the last example here of an off-grid solution is one that's not quite as popular in Ireland. It's more probably popular in the US, is that there's a lot of oil and gas extraction that goes on in the US, and usually on these oil and gas sites what they do is they flare any excess gas that appears during that extraction process. But what Bitcoin miners have now done is this similar concept, this buyer of last resort idea, which is instead of flaring the excess gas, you funnel it through a generator and you mine Bitcoin with it. And so what they're seeing on some of these oil and gas sites is a 63% reduction in CO2 emissions, because methane flares are quite inefficient by nature. You're firing the methane up into the air and you're trying to ignite it, and if it's a gusty day, it doesn't always ignite. Whereas with this, you're getting that 99.99% combustion, and the oil and gas guys are now being incentivized to not flare the gas. Because recently, people are kind of lobbying for methane captures to be put in place, but if there's no financial incentive for them to do it, why would they, until that appears? And so that's what Bitcoin miners have brought to the oil and gas industry, is that this oil and gas currently, we're in a transitionary period in terms of energy. The oil and gas needs to come out of the ground regardless. You're better off doing it in a less CO2 intense way. And so, as I was saying, what's in it for an energy producer? People might be looking at me saying, a farmer is going to want absolutely nothing to do with Bitcoin. And so there's, a number of models that you can kind of take with it, which is that, someone like Skilling Mining can pay for the infrastructure and put it in place, and they can just do a power purchase agreement with that person's small-scale anaerobic digester. You might have an individual who's very Bitcoin savvy. They want to own all the infrastructure and have their own closed system. Or people might want to do revenue shares, which is they say, I want you to pay me for some of my electricity, but I'd like to keep some of the Bitcoin. And ultimately, I feel like long-term, that's how this idea will start to develop, is that people at the beginning will just start off not wanting anything to do with Bitcoin. They'll say, I want the small-scale anaerobic digester, I want this perfect buyer next to it, but I just want this power purchase agreement to exist between the two of them. I want my 6 cents a kilowatt hour, and I never want to hear about Bitcoin. But I think over time, that will change, and ultimately you'll have individuals taking a small little share of Bitcoin, and that will ultimately increase. But I suppose another interesting model that Bitcoin mining might bring is this bottom point here, in that there are currently renewable sites around the country that, for one reason or another, have been left off-grid, and sometimes it's been through rushed planning, or a desire to get a payment that from the government that they thought would come and never did, and now they're sitting there with these off-grid sites with no real world use case for them. They're just kind of venting the energy that they're producing through heat, or they're selling it to the fella across the road, and they're ultimately left with excess. And what Bitcoin mining can do is that can actually revive these off-grid assets, because a lot of these individuals that perhaps built these anaerobic digesters might have done so assuming they'll get a grid connection, or assuming that when they get a grid connection that they'll get a subsidy, and that subsidy never came, and now there's no incentive to go and get the grid connection that they previously planned to do. But I suppose what we'll get into is that Bitcoin can operate in the demand side market, which is what we'll talk about next. So this is another kind of critical idea of how Bitcoin, we've ran through the off-grid solutions, which is, your flared gas, sticking a container on a wind site that's being constrained, or a completely closed system off-grid, running with small-scale anaerobic digestion. But where it can also be quite meaningful is operating on-grid. And so, as you were saying earlier, in Ireland we have a heavily renewable grid, which means we have a non-synchronous form of energy, and as a result we need to balance that energy and we need to balance that heartbeat. And there's a lot of grid mechanisms that the Irish government has got brought in, an air grid, and one of them is capacity and DS3 payments, which essentially all they do is they go around to industries and say, if the grid is ever struggling, will you switch off? And as a result, if the person agrees, this is the payment you get, and there's a lot of detail that goes into those payments. But it's something that's happening because we have such a heavily renewable grid. We need to go around to all these different industries saying, if we're ever struggling, will you switch off? And so what's actually happening around the world is that they're starting to realize that Bitcoin mining is the most perfect match for this idea of demand-side management. And so in Texas at the moment, they have a hugely heavily renewable grid. And of course, they're building kind of your staples, their batteries, but they're also reaching out to individuals who will consume energy, but also switch off extremely quickly. And so what they're doing in Texas is that they're reaching out to Bitcoin miners saying, we need a buyer for this energy so we can build more renewable capacity. But at the same time, this buyer needs to be flexible. We need, if the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, we need this buyer to switch off. And ultimately what you're getting is this influx of miners to Texas, and the CEO of ERCOT, which is the Texas Grid Management, is saying, we want more. Because we want to build the renewables, we need a buyer for them, but we also need them to switch off if the grid is ever struggling. And ultimately I feel like that's where the Irish grid system should go. Because currently, we have a long line of individuals that want to build out renewable capacity, but we're just not in a position to take it onto our grid yet. And so we have plans to, build interconnectors and send it to France, or we send it to the UK. But there's something to be said about building these capabilities internally and keeping that demand in Ireland, because I suppose what we're currently doing with our current plans is that we want to send this economic value abroad. But what Texas is saying is that what we do is we build the demand here and then we build the renewables to meet. And if the renewables will then switch off, ultimately what we're getting is a net increase in renewable capacity, which is giving us a more secure, resilient grid. And so I ultimately think that our demand side mix in Ireland is currently batteries. One of them is going to be green hydrogen, but another one is going to be Bitcoin mining. Because one of the key aspects of it is that it's a single process. So some of the people that they're currently reaching out to in the Irish grid might be, cement factories or industrial processes like Glanbia or Dairygold, and they might say, if we ever need you to switch off, will you do so? But there's a lot that goes into switching off a mechanism like that. You have to send people home, you have to cut processes short, you have to change working hours. But Bitcoin is a highly intensive, one single process. And while that sounds complicated, all that means is that if you want to switch these machines off, you can do it in an instant. And so these machines will consume 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But if you want to switch them off, they'll be off in 5 seconds, and you can turn them off indefinitely. And so what ERCOT is realizing, and I feel like what ERCOT will ultimately realize, is that yes, we need our green hydrogen, yes, we need our batteries, but we also need this perfectly interruptible demand on the grid as well, in order to have that balance and to keep that heartbeat of our grid at that 50 hertz. And I feel like the success that it's currently seeing in Texas, and the demand that grid system is currently reaching out for more and more and more miners, should ultimately come to Ireland. And I suppose on top of that, where I kind of see the long-term aspect of Bitcoin mining going is a kind of a harmony between Bitcoin miners and energy producers, where they'll both become the same thing. And so these are just kind of what look like complicated numbers, but what it essentially does is that if you're a renewable generator, which is that you build an anaerobic digester, instead of building an anaerobic digester that just solely sells to the grid, you build an anaerobic digester that just mines Bitcoin. And while that might sound counterintuitive to the grid, it's actually more efficient for the energy producer, and the grid gets the energy that it needs, because what you'll do is you'll build your anaerobic digester like you always would. You'll connect it to Bitcoin mining, and that'll be your main process. But what you'll do is you'll sign your miners up to the DS3 and capacity markets, which is this demand side management, And if the grid ever needs the energy that you're sending to the miners, you'll simply switch the miners off in a second and you'll fire it back at the grid. And so what the AD generator, or the person who invests in the AD, is getting is they're getting this perfectly constant buyer. They're getting their demand side payments for firing the energy to the grid whenever it needs it, which will only be when the grid is struggling most. And at the same time, from a mining perspective, the reason it's such a perfect mix is that if you were to say in the morning Bitcoin goes to zero, I know a lot of us don't think that'll ever happen. I don't think it will ever happen. It's a no-brainer for me. But what it will do is that, from an investment standpoint, is that the anaerobic digester just acts as a hedge against the mining. So in that off chance that Bitcoin ever stops or goes to zero, you still have an anaerobic digester that will keep sending energy to the grid for the next decade and pay itself off. But I suppose what the miners offer the anaerobic digester is this possibility of huge asymmetric upside, which is that if Bitcoin mining or Bitcoin price kind of goes parabolic or goes through a very strong run, you might pay your anaerobic digester back in half the time that the guy across the road does. And if someone comes along and says, you shouldn't be mining because the grid needs that energy, you're participating in the de-extreme capacity markets. If the grid ever needs the energy that anaerobic digester is producing, it's going to get it. And so that's kind of a perfect mix where you're contributing to the sustainability and security of the grid by signing it up. You funded an AD just through Bitcoin mining. And at the same time, you're offering the AD a quicker payback, and miner is also happy because they're getting their cheap electricity 24/7. And if anything was to ever happen in the mining market, you still own an anaerobic digester and you can keep that thing running for 10 to 12 years until you've paid off the capex on your miners and you paid off the anaerobic digester as well. So I suppose some of the takeaways that I kind of would like to take from today is that I would ask people to contextualize the figures that you're seeing every single day, because I know it can kind of be hard to get away from this constant narrative that Bitcoin just consumes, and it's really worthless for everything else. Well, one simple figure is that Bitcoin uses less than 1% of the global energy, and so recently when the European Union was planning on banning Bitcoin mining, I was sitting there thinking, we have some of the highest electricity rates in the world. No one is mining on your grids because why would you? It's not worthwhile. It's not profitable. It was just quite a simple out to say what we're going to do is ban proof of work mining, and people are going to assume that it's actually making a difference, when in reality it would make no difference at all. That's a key factor for me, is that understand the figures that you're seeing. So some of those headlines at the beginning, which was Bitcoin mining is using more energy than some countries. The Bitcoin network is using about 120 terawatts a year, or at any given moment is 13 gigawatts. And with this renewable idea in mind of demand-side management, which is where heavily renewable grids are going to need batteries, they're going to need green hydrogen, and they're going to need another highly interruptible demand on the grid, that whenever it's needed, they can defibrillate the grid, which is essentially send that energy back. And what the International Energy Agency has come out and said is that for us to meet our 2050 goals, by 2030, the world is going to need about 500 gigawatts of demand side sitting on grid all around the world. So that's going to be batteries, it's going to be hydrogen, it's going to be Bitcoin mining. And so while you are looking at headlines thinking, God, the Bitcoin network uses a lot of energy, it's only using 13 gigawatts. And the demand side market is going to have to be 500 gigawatts large by 2030. And so you could fit the Bitcoin network into the demand side market a few times over. And I suppose another thing then, going to the off-grid aspect of it, there's a lot of decarbonisation that can be done because of this unfussy, constant buyer of energy. So as I was saying, you have your flared gas solutions. In Ireland, I think there's a real place for this small-scale anaerobic digestion closed system, which is where they're crying out for an incentive to actually put this in place. But currently the financials don't add up. And I think by bringing Bitcoin mining to Ireland and the understanding of Bitcoin mining, these farmers might finally say, actually, I will take this small-scale anaerobic digester now because I can actually pay it off, and it actually makes sense. And then as a result, we'll be reducing emissions on farms all across the country. And one last kind of point that I would like to talk about is this e-waste narrative. I see a lot of individuals talking about, how much waste Bitcoin is producing. And one of the assumptions that these articles make, and it's an article that I see all the time, is that these machines, the ones that you're seeing right there, are going to be worthless after 1.5 to 2 years. And straight away from experience, I can see the practical use cases of these machines in that, especially on the flared oil and gas fields in the US, those small machines are still running 6 years later. This assumption that machines are basically worthless after a year and a half and they're going to be put in the bin is quite ridiculous, because if those machines can produce 5 cents a kilowatt hour, they're going to be on a site somewhere, which is what they're still doing. And so if you're getting the energy for free because it's wasted, those machines are going to continue to be used. And ultimately what I feel like will happen in Ireland is that these new machines are going to cycle into these old machines, and that might not make a lot of sense right now, but currently this assumption that 1.5 years they're going to be worthless is ridiculous, because that machine now for us in skilling mining is a high uptime machine. So because it's so expensive and it's so profitable, we want that machine on all the time. But what's going to happen is over the course of the next few years, that machine is simply going to replace that old one that's been running for 6 years. And how I see that working in practical sense is that when you look at the wind farms, you're not going to put a brand new machine on a wind farm that's only going to be giving you energy 20% of the year. It doesn't make sense. You want to be paying back that machine as fast as you can. What will happen is you'll have high uptime sites and you'll have soakage sites. And all that means is that you'll have low uptime sites. And what will happen is that that new machine, as it becomes less and less and less profitable and becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, will transition from a high uptime machine that you always want on to a low uptime machine, which is where we'll put that on a wind farm. It might only be turned on 30% of the year. But for that wind farm owner, you'd rather you get 2 cents a kilowatt hour instead of nothing. Or at night time, sometimes if they can't turn down or feather their blades fast enough, they actually get penalised for sending that energy to the grid, which basically means that they've given the energy away for -4 cents a kilowatt hour. That's how bad things can actually get on the Irish grid. And so all these kind of machines will do, as they become worthless in quotes, is they'll transition from a high uptime machine to a low uptime machine, and they'll essentially act as soakage for these renewable sites. And I suppose there's a really kind of interesting concept that currently you have negative price energy, as I said, which is during the night electricity goes to -4 cents because this wind farm is like, I need to get rid of this energy, someone needs to take it off me. But what these machines might eventually do is bring the global price floor of energy to zero. And while that might sound ridiculous, you might have these small soakage containers, which is like the ones we build in Skilling, filled with machines that were basically worthless, but at least they're bringing that price of energy at night time from -4 cents up to 1 cent. Or they're bringing it from -4 cents to 0 cent, and they're not being penalised because they at least have something to consume the energy. And ultimately I feel like that's where the mix is going, is that these renewable generators are going to see these machines as sponges on their sites, that you fill a container with them and it'll take excess energy whenever it needs to. And so ultimately I feel like Ireland's kind of renewable transition, while they don't realise it yet, has a big spot for it in Bitcoin mining. It's only just a matter of building understanding, which is where in Skilling, with our first site tomorrow, we want to build this understanding and showcase that, this isn't just an investment vehicle, it's actually a really practical network. And the Bitcoin mining process and the proof of work process and how it interacts with energy is an extremely important one, and one that we need to learn about. And so that's kind of our goal over the next couple of months and years. So that's everything from me, guys.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here today. I'm just going to share some of my thoughts from spending some time learning and thinking about Bitcoin over the past year or so. I know you probably have a mixed audience. Some people probably know very little about it, and some people probably know a hell of a lot more about me. But wherever you fit into that, I hope you take something useful away from my talk today. Before I start, I want to confess to something. I'm not particularly comfortable standing here talking to you. And you might think that's because I fear public speaking, and that's kind of the cliche. It's not quite that. I don't feel like I'm fully qualified to stand up here and talk to you. I don't have a background in economics. I don't think the Leaving Cert economics qualifies me to do so. But I wouldn't dare accept an invite to stand up in front of a crowd and speak about something within the remit of a doctor or a dentist or an engineer. However, I think there's something qualitatively different about this topic, about Bitcoin. It appears to be one of the most multidisciplinary topics that exists. It touches on economics, politics, law, history, psychology, mathematics, and many, many more topics. So I don't think it can be packaged into one degree. Programmers might have a very detailed understanding of the code and the blockchain and how that works, but that doesn't give them a good macro overview of human behavior. I think that Bitcoin introduces an instrument into the field of economics that has never existed before, which may just transform it utterly. If the rules of chess were changed overnight so that pawns could move in any direction, I think you might find that even the grandmasters would have a hard time getting their heads around the new game. I think bringing all of this together requires a certain amount of thinking from first principles. I know Dinny has mentioned it, but I just want to stress before I go any further, and this isn't a cliche get out of jail free card, but none of this is investment advice. I'm not qualified to give you investment advice, and I think the only thing that's certain is that nothing is. What I want to do here is to help to try and drive a conversation about something that I think is actually really important. So I want to talk about a number of topics today, which should be considered ramblings and musings. I've changed my mind on many things over the years, and I don't think that will ever change that process. So to keep myself focused, I've broken the talk into 3 parts. First, I want to share with you how I conceptualize Bitcoin. In the second part, I will try and explain why I think Bitcoin will likely become global money. And finally, I will take a look at just a few of the ways that I think Bitcoin can plausibly change the world. So I want to frame this talk with a quote before I dive in. This quote is from an economist that died 3 months before I was born, Friedrich Hayek, and he wrote, "Economic control is not merely a control of a sector of human life which can be separated from the rest. It is the control of the means for all our ends. And whoever has sole control of the means must also determine which ends are to be served, which values are to be rated higher and which lower. In short, what men should believe and strive for." And I hope the relevance of this powerful quote will become evident in the third part of this presentation. So to kick off, at first glance, Bitcoin might seem exciting. There's a lot of noise and a lot of hype. When you don't know a whole lot about it, you may conjure the image of the infamous Bitcoin logo that's in front of you there, stylized in an ever more sophisticated manner on each new magazine cover, crispier, shinier. You have no clue what a Bitcoin is when you first start, but you know you want one. You hear jargon about digital tokens, and it feels like perhaps Bitcoin is a system of upgraded intelligent gold coins stored somewhere in the cloud. You might have got that impression from Dinny. But perhaps a Bitcoin is made of vibranium, like Captain America's shield, but with quantum microchips embedded inside. No matter how far along the journey we come, or we are, we probably all remember asking ourselves, what is a Bitcoin? And seeming perplexed by the concept. The truth is, and I'm sorry to burst your bubble if you're quite new to this, but Bitcoin itself is just a boring ledger, a database. It is more in common with Microsoft Excel than it does with any weapons used by an Avengers character. Sure, it's not quite the same as a traditional spreadsheet because it's decentralized and it can't be controlled by any one person. But all it really does is track, verify and record the movement of 21 million pieces of made-up information called Bitcoins. And they're literally just bits of information, there's no coins necessary. Even movement is a strong word to describe what Bitcoin and what it does. When you send and receive a Bitcoin, it doesn't even really leave or enter your computer, despite the fact that Dinny was going to send some down for his holidays. It doesn't go anywhere, in fact. It is merely the decentralized ledger associating that portion of Bitcoin supply with a different public address, which can be accessed from anywhere in the world. In our Microsoft Excel analogy, it's pretty much the same as moving a number from one cell of this Excel sheet to another and password protecting it. You know, yawn. It's mundane. It's pretty boring, I think. I'm sure some of you are on the edges of your seats about to interrupt me for underselling the true magnitude of Satoshi's innovation in solving the Byzantine generals problem. And what this problem described was how to create a decentralized ledger that could not be cheated. So how do you maintain consensus without a central authority to control things, to prevent double spending? How do you create digital scarcity? The use of proof-of-work mining, which Mark outlined so elegantly, the system of block rewards, the halving cycles, the seemingly immaculately balanced difficulty adjustments, and so on. There's a concept in physics and philosophy known as the finely tuned universe, and some of you might have heard of it. It's where experts marvel that if even one of many, many different physical variables was even slightly different, life couldn't possibly exist. And it seems, so far anyway, that Bitcoin's engineering is quite finely balanced. But good engineering aside, demystifying what Bitcoin is and realizing how seemingly mundane it is, in my opinion, is the first step to better understanding it. Bitcoin is not exciting for what it is. It is exciting for what its existence does and could actually mean for the world. The fact that a boring old ledger can be maintained between peers and without the requirement for a central authority, it may seem at first glance to be trivial and unimportant, but it is anything but, and I'm going to try and explain why. Before I do that, I'm going to explain why I think that Bitcoin has value. Whenever I discuss Bitcoin with friends, I try to make clear that we shouldn't conflate two separate concepts, that although we're interconnected, they should be treated separately. So the first of these is a discussion about whether Bitcoin will continue to rise in value. And the second is a more normative discussion around whether it will be a good or a bad thing for the world. So while of course these things are intertwined, if it's going to be a good thing for the world, that might lead regulation one way rather than the other. But I do think these things are best treated separately, and that's essentially what these next two parts of this presentation are. Most would argue that the internet, once invented, was always going to spread, absent any consideration of its impact on the world. And arguably, the impacts of democratizing information, as the internet has done, couldn't have been fully known when it was first invented, and probably aren't still fully understood to this day. And I think Bitcoin will probably be the same. Bitcoin essentially uses the rails of the internet to democratize money. And that's why, in this part of this talk, I'm going to try and focus on why I think it is likely that it will continue to grow in value. Not just that, it's why I believe it will practically eat all value. So there are many different ways of approaching why Bitcoin will continue to increase in value over time. The most straightforward and probably the most common, and many of you have probably heard an explanation similar to this, is probably to look at the history of money, to explain why Bitcoin is sound money, and then to explain why sound money will steal value from money that isn't so sound. If you read any Bitcoin book or blog, you will get an overview of the various forms of money that have paved the road from barter to the monetary system that we have today. We once used ledgers drawn on cave walls to keep score of what was owed. We used shells and beads. We used coinage from precious metals. We used paper that represented gold. And now, in one sense, we use digital money that represents the paper that used to represent the gold. So for those of you familiar with the concept, yes, it's giant turtles all the way down. I will spare you the intricate details of this evolution because it is easily found elsewhere, but there was one important lesson to draw from it. When you look at how money originated and changed over the centuries, you start to realise that all of these things were essentially just accounting systems. In our zoomed-in, close-up encounter with money, we often think of it as being valuable in and of itself. And I think this is a real mistake. It's only valuable as money because of the system, because there's value in the greater system that it forms a part of, in facilitating the exchange of things of real value. The accounting systems that worked had certain properties that were derived from the national states. We know that these properties were what they were, and Dinny has outlined them. The sand on the beach is portable, recognisable, and highly divisible, but it didn't make good money because it wasn't scarce, and it would be illogical to trade anything of value for sand. Very few things have really worked. Gold is probably the best example of money that nature has ever provided. It wasn't and isn't perfect, but it was the best of bad options. It was in or around the right level of scarce. There are metals that are rarer than gold, but if there isn't enough for everybody to have at least some, it can't be used to facilitate barter. There's too much water for that to be scarce enough to trade. Gold also importantly had a low stock-to-flow ratio. So for those of you familiar with this concept, it means that a very little new gold is created every year, and this is about 2% of the existing supply, and that remains relatively constant. So the most important thing to understand when thinking about gold is to recognise why it had such value. And I think we often put the cart before the horse in our mental model of gold, thinking that surely it is valuable because it is nice and shiny, and that makes people want it. Fast forward today, and we're giving out golden globes, we're calling people golden children, and we are giving gold medals to Olympic winners. But here's the thing, gold isn't naturally prettier than silver or bronze, or at the very least that's subjective. Leaving aside that they all have some industrial use cases, it was gold's properties that made it valuable. It is recognisable, verifiable, durable and scarce. It ticked many of the boxes of good money. It became an accounting system against which the value of all other things were measured, and it developed to eventually back the global economy. The single most important way to look at gold is as a physical accounting system, not as something that is valuable per se, but as something that represents value. Understanding this is a key to understanding Bitcoin's value. Was gold perfect? No. Its primary flaws related to its physical form, which gave it some of the characteristics that made it good money. But it was difficult to transport, protect, and not particularly easy to divide. This provided an incentive to centralisation. So fast forward to the 1900s, and gold is held primarily in the vaults of central banks, with paper notes and coinage which can be redeemed for gold being used for convenience. The scarcity of these currencies was derived from their peg to gold. The peg was changed a number of times over the years, and finally in 1971, in what was known as the Nixon shock, this peg was eventually severed, marking the end of the Bretton Woods system, which you may have heard of before. So the interesting thing about this is that until 1971, humans were essentially just trading gold. For the past 51 years, we have been trading fiat currencies that derive their scarcity only from governments and central banks resisting the urge to print more. As you may be aware, this urge seems to be irresistible. Even the strongest fiat currencies inflate at some rate. You may be aware that we target inflation at 2% a year, which means that we want prices, measured by the Consumer Price Index, to rise 2%, despite the fact that technology and efficiency should be making everything in the world cheaper. So how does all of this relate to Bitcoin? Money has always merely been a way of representing and accounting for value. In some ways, you'll hear people like Warren Buffett give out that Bitcoin has no value. And in some ways he's right. You can't eat it or sleep in it. It's not going to keep you warm on a deserted island. But that is to take an overly narrow view of the meaning of value. There is a value in having a better system of accounting for value, for storing value, and for transferring value. To miss this is to overlook the entire point. If you take one thing from my talk today, take the idea that Bitcoin's inherent value is valuing other things and doing it better than anything else ever has. The bookkeeping software that a company uses may not bring in any revenue itself. Does this make it valueless? Of course not. It allows the company to understand its business better, to make better decisions. It saves the time of employees through efficiency. It is like having a better map when you head out on a hike. There is an obvious value in that. So within this frame, there are two primary reasons that I think Bitcoin will become global money and value everything. The first is scarcity. There has never before been an asset that is absolutely scarce but infinitely divisible, ever. Gold supply increased 2% a year, which is why it was more valuable than silver, whose supply increased significantly more than that. It's almost a law of nature that value flows to more scarce assets. And this is simply a result of people collectively acting rationally. People want to retain their value. Dinny gave the same example, but if you had 2 buckets of water, and you want 2 buckets and you wanted to keep water in them, you'd put the water in the bucket without a hole if you wanted to keep your water. So people acting rationally over time will put money into a non-inflationary currency. Friends have previously asked me, what if people just lose interest in Bitcoin? And I think it's an interesting question. To me, it seems almost self-evident that value will continue to accrue into Bitcoin because of its scarcity. Almost in the same way as if you showed me a picture of a ball on a hill, I'd be able to predict with a relative degree of certainty that the ball would roll down the hill rather than up. But I have tried to come up with a small thought experiment to try and explain why I think this is so. So, you probably can't read the captions, but at a hugely simplified level, Bitcoin's price can be derived primarily from 2 groups of people. Those who've adopted it because they understand that it is sound money, aka the hodlers, and those who speculate or trade or buy it because the price is going up and sell it because the price is going down. The orange line represents the adoption by hodlers, and the blue line represents the price when you factor in the speculators and the traders and everybody else. When you look at the price, it is impossible to know how much of it is comprised of the former and the latter groups, but this also explains why the price is very often just noise in the greater scheme of things. So let's add some control measures to this experiment. Let's remove the speculators and assume that all the Bitcoin in the world is held by hodlers, and it's already mined. Now, instead of these hodlers being spread throughout the world as they currently are, let's group them all into one country. Let us assume that interest in Bitcoin is fizzled out. So it's only these hodlers that hold Bitcoin. We are now going to compare this country to another country with the same population, productivity, and level of wealth. So again, you probably can't read the captions, but the orange circle represents a country on a Bitcoin standard. The 21 million Bitcoin represents all the productivity and wealth of the citizens of that country. The blue circle represents an identical country on a fiat standard. For the sake of simplicity, let us assume that the sum of all the country's wealth is represented by 21 million euro. Now, the collective wealth of both countries is the same. However, in fiat country, the government inflates the money supply by 7% per year. After 4 years, there are now 27.5 million euro in circulation. It's really important to remember that this doesn't necessarily make the country any richer or poorer in itself. They merely redistribute the claims to all the productivity in the country in various ways, depending on whether the inflation was through loans or extra government spending. In the Bitcoin country, the supply of 21 million doesn't change. Any government spending comes directly from taxation, and any loans come from other savings. So, over time, the population of fiat countries start to notice that the exchange rate between their country and the Bitcoin country is always changing. Their currency seems to buy less and less Bitcoin every single year. The question then becomes, is it more likely that people from the fiat country will convert their currency to Bitcoin, or more people from the Bitcoin country will convert their Bitcoin to euros? I think all else being equal, the answer is quite obvious. So look, this is almost a silly example, but I think it captures the crux of the point. Sound money will swallow value from non-sound money over time. I mentioned that there was a second reason that I think value will continue to accrue to Bitcoin, and this is efficiency. The global monetary system that we have is highly inefficient. Visa charges merchants anything from 1.5 to 3.5%, depending on the card company, and this price is ultimately paid by you in your goods and services. This is a significant cost just to transact value, and that's before we even discuss remittances to poorer countries and other things like that. With various layers being built atop Bitcoin, such as Lightning, this would be far cheaper and incentivise a switch on top of the value storage proposition. I think to sum up this point, the human race has evolved with numerous standards of many different things. There are hundreds of languages, cultures, customs and religions. Various standards of money emerge naturally in a physical world with clearly defined borders because of a lack of interconnectedness. But in a digital age, we only need one form of money for the world. The good money will eventually drive out the bad, and all money will tend to one. You don't ever want to be using the second best form of money. That's why the value of everything in the world, in my opinion, will credibly be divided by 21 million. So, Bitcoin is a boring, incorruptible, decentralized ledger that approximates perfect money and may well eventually represent all the value in the world. So what are the implications of this? And I think I have to say that if we haven't already, this is where we do enter the realm of speculation. The truth is, nobody knows how a Bitcoin standard, or hyper-Bitcoinization as it is known, if it arrives, will play out. We have never seen sound money reassert itself from the ground up on the rails of the internet before. So all we can do is make informed guesses. But with that caveat in mind, there are implications that, in my opinion, are credible, logical consequences of sound money. And as such, they deserve to be engaged with very seriously. I'm going to speak about just a very small selection of them. Probably the most obvious implication of a Bitcoin standard is that it allows everybody to participate in the economy on the same terms. The Cantillon effect describes the way in which those closest to the source of power in an economy benefit disproportionately from the expansion of the money supply. Everyone will have a different view on this, but there doesn't have to be any malevolence involved. It can just be a result of incentive structures and realpolitik. Why do governments and central banks inflate the money supply? Very often it is a result of us, their populations, demanding more and more from them. Perhaps it is an inevitable consequence of democracy, where politicians are incentivized to prioritise the short-term demands of the voters with a 4-year election cycle. There are also economic theories at play. Increasing the availability of credit when the economy is sluggish is supposed to make borrowing easier and stimulate growth. This is all really complicated stuff that I don't propose to get into in detail, but the thing is, very often it involves borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today. We all know it's easier to pop a Red Bull than to head to the gym. And even if this isn't always a bad thing, which itself is quite debatable, it seems that we have probably passed a tipping point such that national debts won't ever be repaid through increased productivity, but rather solely through further borrowing and currency debasement, which comes with its own costs. Ireland's national debt is €240 billion, and that's equivalent to 243% of the government's annual revenues from tax and other sources. We seem to have a general consensus in society that a little bit of inflation is good, while a lot is bad. That's why we often hear of a 2% inflation target. I have to admit that is about as intuitive to me as homeopathy. I think Michael Saylor, I'm going to call him Michael Saylor, quite recently said that inflation is just hyperinflation in slow motion. And that sounds like a more credible narrative of it. Inflation is an obvious consequence of an inflating money supply, right? Well, I would have thought so, but I've been genuinely surprised over the last few months. With inflation at 8% or whatever it is today, I still haven't heard much at all in connection with monetary policy when you listen to the airwaves. Of course, it is important that we don't overcorrect with an equal lack of balance on the other side. Supply chain difficulties, of course, lead to higher prices, and there is a lot going on in the world regarding the availability of fuel and food that we should not brush to the side. But the thing is, when you increase the supply of money, you mathematically increase the denominator of the price of everything, even if the impact isn't immediate. Prices are the conductor in the economy, which is the orchestra. When the price signals are distorted, the orchestra plays suboptimally, while the markets try to figure out where an ever-changing equilibrium lies. I think it's really important to understand that money isn't productivity, it's a claim to productivity. It is important to remember that when a government or central bank prints money, they are not increasing productivity. They are merely redistributing the existing claims to productivity in a way that is highly opaque. The total goods and services in an economy remains constant. However, the way in which they can be claimed or put to use is essentially reshuffled. Generally speaking, it is the better off in society that benefit from this redistribution through the availability of cheaper loans, etc. Of course, we also use some of this money to pay for social welfare, so it is anything but simple, and I'm not here to claim otherwise. One thing is, however, apparent to me. People have little to no understanding of how this works. We seem to have a form of Stockholm syndrome when it comes to inflation, and you may notice that monetary debasement is the one factor that isn't discussed ad nauseum when we talk about the increased cost of living. The fact that almost nobody is aware of how their wealth is being redistributed is surely problematic. There is a clear democratic deficit in a system that has such a significant impact on the way we live our lives and our means to do so, but yet is not subject to the same scrutiny as is the case when governments pass other bills that involve spending money. Bitcoin is often described as a hedge against inflation. The truth is, in my opinion, that in the short term, it's not. Gold became regarded as a hedge against inflation because of the constant rebalancing caused by the trade-off between an inert lump of rock and a currency that was deflating like a piece of ice. With Bitcoin, there's no such trade-off. But the thing that's important to understand that in a world dominated by inflationary currencies, where Bitcoin is still seen as a speculative asset and is finding its value, it is the opposite of an inflation hedge in the short term. Its price is currently inversely correlated with inflation because of monetary policy expectations, risk on, risk off, for those of you familiar with it. But ultimately and most importantly, Bitcoin's success marks the death knell of constant and persistent inflation. The next thing I want to talk about is the definancialization of other assets, and this is where I think this all becomes quite tangible to people. The absence of sound money means that people cannot save the value of their economic time and energy in their currency, so instead they turn to other assets to do this, and this has enormously negative consequences. While the stock market is also a relevant example, I think the clearest manifestation of this is property prices. You can't turn on the radio today without hearing a segment about soaring property prices and the fact that people can't afford to get on the infamous ladder. You will hear policy debates about increasing the borrowing ratio, help to buy schemes, rent controls, and so on. We are doing a thoroughly good job of discussing the best arrangement for the deck chairs on the Titanic. We discuss everything under the sun other than the actual root cause of the problem, or at the very least a significant aspect of it. There is clear data, including from the ESRI, that homes are now significantly less affordable than they were years ago in the 1970s and the 80s. We often hear about international investment funds buying up large swathes of properties in Ireland, but we almost never stop to ask why a retirement fund for German firefighters needs buy-to-let properties in Dublin. This why is related to the failure of the money to keep its value over time. To preserve economic value, investors must buy a diversified portfolio of assets which will maintain purchasing power in lockstep and in tandem with the increase in money supply. This is all well and good for those with property and stock portfolios. However, it is to the significant detriment of those without. A clarifying example, and again another almost silly example, is the following. Let us say the average salary needed to buy an apartment or a property in Dublin is €60,000, just by the law of averages. That's probably not the case. I've heard 100,000 quoted, but we'll go with this. You have two professionals working in Dublin. One of them is on €55,000 a year, and one of them is on €60,000 a year. Now, these two individuals shouldn't experience a significant difference in their quality of life, I think you'll agree, judging by their income. However, the first individual cannot afford a mortgage and must rent for life. This could be €1,000 every month with absolutely nothing to show for it at the end. The second worker gets a mortgage for €1,000 a month, if not cheaper, perhaps rents out a room. They are lucky enough to have just reached escape velocity to avoid the rent trap. By the end of their career, they have accumulated their full equity of their home and can retire with a much better standard of living than the first worker. This is a simple example. However, by inflating the money supply, we are picking winners and losers. Not just this, the gap between these winners and losers gets ever more pronounced. Another very tangible benefit of the reintroduction of sound money is the ability to plan for your financial future without having to either qualify as a professional investor or pay a portion of your hard-earned pension to a fund to just spread it to the four winds, which essentially is what is done. There used to be an obvious distinction between saving and investing, and the former should be risk-free, but this no longer exists. Savings have a demonstrably negative return, so now we are all investors of necessity, forced to participate in a casino-like attempt to maintain our wealth through the exaggerated boom-bust cycles that are inherent with an inflationary currency. What I find amazing is that we don't seem to ever step back and ask ourselves? How have we found ourselves in this situation? Probably my most brief point, but this is the most important point I'll make tonight. It's easy for us to forget that most people in the world don't have a bank account, don't have a stable currency, or any way of accumulating or preserving the fruits of their economic labour. I have lived in both Lebanon and Syria over the last number of years, and I've witnessed currencies devaluing at more than 200% per year. I have seen just how people in such countries value holding dollars as opposed to their own currencies. The only way they can hold these dollars is in cash. It's been estimated up to 87% of the world's population lives either under an autocratic regime or in a country with double-digit inflation. In such countries, the people are quite literally having their wealth stolen by corrupt governments, without any way to resist. For these people, Bitcoin is and will be in the future a life raft. It provides a universal property right with anyone that has an access to the internet, which is enforced irrespective of politics by the rules of code. It's really important to remember this context when people who are fortunate enough to live in Western democracies like us accuse Bitcoin of being a Ponzi scheme. So the final issue I'll mention, and I think it's likely that there will always be things that humans are willing to go to war over and to fight over. However, there is a genuine case to be made that Bitcoin disincentivizes war and makes it harder to fund and sustain. Every time there has been a large war, it has been funded significantly through currency debasement, and the evidence for this is quite compelling. Every time the gold peg was either adjusted or when it was finally severed, this was as a direct result of a need to fund the war, which is evidence in itself. When currency cannot be debased, it can only be can only be paid for through the direct taxation of the citizens. Therefore, the will of the citizens is required to fight a war, not the political establishment, who may or may not have connections with the military-industrial complex or various other parties. But I think this is quite a profound point that is worth reflecting on. As Saifuddin Ammous recently said in a podcast, under the gold standard, a king could fight until he ran out of his own gold. With fiat, a government can fight until its citizens run out of all liquid wealth. And I think this ties into the greater idea of clarifying the social contract between citizens and state. As citizens, we don't have an accurate perception of the cost of things in our societies. A transparent social contract would be one in which we pay our taxes, and these are used to pay for the things we truly want as a society, not through the highly opaque method of currency inflation. This would impose important checks and balances to the system and ensure the accountability of governments to their citizens. So, before I reach my conclusion, which is coming, I promise, the things I have spoken about are all pretty positive, evidently. Fix the money, fix the world, and all that. And I haven't even brushed on the idea that sound money may, in fact, change our time preference to allow us to plan for the future and live together in a sustainable way on our planet. But I think it's really important for me, while I'm up here, to point out that there are huge unknowns. The thing is, while I believe quite strongly that the world of a Bitcoin standard is likely to be a better place, getting there may be very bumpy. What will be the short-term and medium-term impacts of not being able to sustain the current state expenditure without increasing taxation? How will we fund public services, healthcare, and pensions? We cannot take for granted that this transition will be invariably good. It will require significant thought and many serious conversations, which we are just not currently having. And I think this needs to change. I also don't believe we have as much time to have these conversations as we may expect. Bitcoin's spread is exponential, not linear, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic should have taught us all how bad we are at intuitively understanding exponential growth. I think the implications of all of this will be upon us much sooner than most of us probably expect. You will be glad to know I'm coming to a close. I just want to say a few concluding remarks. There is a phenomenon known as a Semmelweis reflex. It is a metaphor for the reflex-like tendency to reject new evidence or knowledge because it contradicts established norms, beliefs, and paradigms. In 1847, a Hungarian physician discovered that childbed fever mortality rates fell tenfold when doctors basically just disinfected their hands with a chlorine solution before moving from one patient to another. This was 20 years before germ theory was discovered. Despite overwhelming empirical evidence, his fellow doctors rejected his hand-washing suggestions, often with derision and for completely non-medical reasons, and some doctors refused to believe that the hands of a gentleman could spread disease. There is a huge amount of reluctance in the world to discussing Bitcoin with an open mind. Bitcoin is a topic that gets a strong reaction from many people. They often feel the need to have an opinion on it without having done much research. As Michael Saylor said, find me someone that has spent 1,000 hours studying Bitcoin and comes back with 83 points of rebuttal. Such people are very rare. I've had countless people tell me I'm wrong about Bitcoin, but I'm still yet to meet someone that has provided a good reason as to why I might be. Lazy analogies of tulips won't cut the mustard, but I am all ears. Bitcoin's concept is sound. It is logical and it is reasonable. It will just take time for it to spread. I'm hoping to get more people in society talking about it. And the good news is that the tide is starting to turn. We are past the point where Bitcoin is just for anarcho-capitalists. A look around the room will tell you how far we have come. Being a Bitcoiner can be a lonely place when you are surrounded by people who think you've lost your marbles. But it's always good to know that you're not alone. Nobody can predict the future. And I always do my best to test my own beliefs and analysis. However, the more time I spend thinking about Bitcoin, the more I believe that with the benefit of hindsight, it will all be pretty obvious. Bitcoin created digital scarcity and allowed value to be transacted peer-to-peer without intermediaries. When you look at other cryptocurrency projects, unlike the early days, very few would even claim to be competing with Bitcoin anymore as sound money. While its code can be copied, its network effects certainly cannot be. The more I think about it, the more I believe that economics students in the decades to come will grow up in a world that takes a Bitcoin standard for granted and will struggle to get their heads around the opaque, the inefficient and the unfair monetary systems we use today. It would seem obvious and intuitive to them that the world uses a single unified monetary standard beyond the control of any single entity. Bitcoin to me is the money that the human race has always been searching for. We have never before had something that is absolutely scarce, infinitely divisible, transferable and secure. We finally have a boring ledger on digital rails that we can trust. Sometimes we're not great at holding conflicting ideas in our heads. I personally think that it's okay to admit that Bitcoin has some similarities with a Ponzi scheme, and please excuse me for saying this, or a cult. It involves a group of people with strongly held beliefs who benefit financially from other people investing money into that thing that they believe in. The thing is though, it can tick most of these boxes and still be a real innovation of value that will succeed. It can walk like a duck and quack like a duck, but it may not be a duck. Sayings are generalizations, not rules. When something truly new and innovative comes along, there is no law of nature that says that it has to fit into previously defined categories. That's why people often reach this, what is in my opinion, a ridiculous impasse about whether Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme or not. You see, the key difference, and this I suppose goes back to the first part of my talk, is that we're not talking about a zero-sum game where you put euros in and you get euros out at some later point. We are talking about migrating to a better system for measuring value that is more accurate and essentially fairer. Another thing I believe us Bitcoiners should accept, and I might get into some trouble for saying this, and come to terms with, is that the transition itself may not be perfectly fair. It isn't fair that the earlier you adopt this system, the better off you will be. You can believe in your own open-mindedness or intelligence and chant about everyone buying it at the price they deserve. But at the end of the day, when you came to Bitcoin, it's going to involve a large degree of luck, who you spoke to and listened to, and the friends that you had. But such is life, it's not necessarily fair, and I think the financial systems and the matter of money demonstrate this clearly. The most important thing about Bitcoin, in my opinion, is that it removes the existing structural unfairness both within countries and between them, and its impacts will be felt for generations to come. Bitcoin really is the most bizarre opportunity that has ever existed. My honest belief is that by buying something that will make you financially better off, you're actually helping to improve the world. It's the perfect Trojan horse. Come for the gains, stay for the cause. By buying Bitcoin, you're casting a tangible vote for a fairer world. There's something intuitively contradictory about that, and it is something that may happen on this scale just once in the history of humankind. It certainly seems too good to be true, but like everything, time will tell. Thanks very much.
How many miners did you get into one of those containers?
So for the container that I had on the slides there, and kind of our standard container is going to be 70 miners. That'll be our go-to. And so 70 miners is around, they're each 3 kilowatts. So you can get about 240 kilowatts, 230 kilowatts worth of energy from one container. But I suppose the joy that we've and the reason we've gone with custom containers is that we'll now build containers to size the exact amount of energy that's available. So when we initially started this journey, we were going with the whole adapting shipping containers idea. What we realised for the Irish market is that a lot of these sites aren't going to be the US sites. They're not going to be a megawatt. They're not going to be 500 kilowatts. Where they can be really meaningful is small scale. And so, as I said, we can build a 50 kilowatt one, and we'll just put 15 machines in, or 10 machines in, or whatever you actually want.
And sorry, just a second question. What kind of network do you plug in? And much network connections and something like that now?
So in terms of the bandwidth, there's actually not a lot of bandwidth on them. That's kind of the joy of these things, is that all they're doing, as I said earlier, is firing computational guesses. And so I don't have an exact figure actually. We've been trying to figure it out, but it always kind of fluctuates because of the nature of firing guesses randomly. But it's very, very little. And so, I think that also kind of suits this brilliant idea of isolated energy consumption and remote energy consumption, because all you need is basically, sometimes when our Wi-Fi goes down, I can run the 5 of them off my mobile hotspot, and they run perfectly. And I could do a test where I keep adding 5 more and 5 more, but that's kind of the estimates that we have, which is very little. How do you become a miner? So in simple terms, you just need to get a machine. You need to buy one of those ASICs, and you need to import it into Ireland. But I suppose what the limitation is to becoming a proper miner is you need to find cheap electricity. And so if you were to run one of those, even the new machines on Irish grid prices at the moment, you basically would just be above break even. And so as a result, of Irish grid prices, running one on grid by yourself at home probably won't be too profitable for you. So to become a proper miner, which is what we're trying to do, it's more of a journey of yes, getting the machines, yes, getting the infrastructure, but ultimately finding the cheap electricity. And that's why we've gone on this journey to find excess electricity or innovative ways to make them work on grid. But to answer your question in short, it's get an ASIC, get electricity that makes sense, and then you're a miner.
Hello, great presentation, guys, thanks. My first question is regulation side of things. I know a lot of people in Bitcoin are kind of fearful where the regulation side of things are going over the next couple of years. So I think, James, you were saying you're in the exchange space, and everyone's saying in the Bitcoin space, don't hold your Bitcoin on exchanges. What are your thoughts on that, and where the regulation side of things are going over the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what's happening is that the banking world, you have a thing called the travel rule. So the banks, they communicate with each other. They send, the sender's details and the recipient's details. So what the European Union lately are trying to do was like ban unhosted wallets. So your Ledger, your Trezor, any wallet on your phone or your laptop that's not tied to an exchange that you have full custody over. They were looking at kind of banning that because you can't actually send and receive sender details to those wallets. So that's a dangerous path, I believe. I believe that destroys the Web3 kind of element of crypto as well. So yeah, that's the way it does seem to be going, because the traditional world are looking at crypto and they're saying, why isn't crypto following the same rules we do in banking? So like when we joined Bitcoin back in the start in 2013, it was all about this idea of transferring value across the world with no intermediaries. And it was kind of that libertarian kind of idea to it. But now slowly the kind of traditional world is trying to sink their teeth into it a little bit and try and tie in their kind of methodologies to crypto. So, but on the flip side, you have Robinhood, you have Revolut, you have Coinbase, are all building Web3 wallets, which are all unhosted wallets. So I think it'll be interesting to see how these two paths will diverge in the next, literally this year, I think will be the deciding factor.
But to add to that, if it comes like you can't hold it off exchanges, will that regulation come like within a week or a day, or will it be like you'll have a year to decide, take your coins off the exchange?
Yeah, these things are very slow. It's like it'll go through initial kind of roundtable discussion in the EU, and then it'll get passed through Parliament and get approved. So yeah, there's no fear in terms of like pulling your coins off platforms, things like that. Yeah, it'll take a long time before you'll see it coming. Like it'll take maybe a year and a half before it'll be implemented.
Good presentation, lads. Thanks. I think one of the most pernicious things that gets in the way of Bitcoin adoption is the hundreds of scams and shitcoins that emerge every cycle. For me, I think people get sold on coins that have lower, price as a unit bias, and most of these things never hold their value against Bitcoin. I'd like to ask each of you, all four of you, to confirm whether you are or aren't a Bitcoin maximalist, and if one of you wants to explain what Bitcoin maximalism is first, and then I'd like to hear from each of you whether or not you are a Bitcoin maximalist. Thanks.
I'll jump on first anyway. I wouldn't say I'm a Bitcoin
Call us out.
Yeah, exactly.
We bought Bitcoin first, but the thing that attracts me is DeFi. So there's not a whole pile of DeFi happening on Bitcoin currently. So you have a lot of cool things that are happening in terms of lending, in terms of automatic swaps that you don't have in Bitcoin yet. We should happen in the future when we have layer 2, like Lightning Network gets more control and takes more flow. So for that reason, I think there's a lot of innovation happening on Ethereum. There's a lot of innovation happening on Matic, layer 2s, and that. that you don't see on Bitcoin yet. Will that come onto Bitcoin? You know, like, can we use Ethereum? Can we use Solana and Cardano as a testing bed for technologies on Bitcoin? Definitely. So I'd love to see, like, you know, Bitcoin, you know, take a kind of major foothold in DeFi space. But currently, you know, DeFi is all in the altcoin market. It's not. There's nothing happening in Bitcoin as such. So for that reason, I would be, you know, not a Bitcoin maximalist.
I think you must be me with the mic. You asked for a definition of a Bitcoin maximalist, and I think, you know, people who've been in this for many years, which doesn't include me, have seen these cycles come and go, and they've seen other projects, tokens, coins, whatever you want to call them, come, take a lot of the limelight, and then ultimately hurt a lot of people. So I think a Bitcoin maxi's view is that there is one real cryptocurrency blockchain innovation. That's Bitcoin. It's not controlled by anybody. It doesn't have a team. It's not a security. It's almost like a property in and of itself. It solves digital scarcity, and everything else is trying to ride on the coattails of that. It's almost trying to take up the fumes from the exhaust of the innovation that is Bitcoin, which is the rocket leaving the earth, and it's trying to grab some of the attention to make a quick buck for people, for a founder or for somebody else. So I think Bitcoin maxis are very hostile to the idea that people should be talking about anything other than Bitcoin. So that's my opinion of what a maxi is, and I think my own opinion is that I can see where Bitcoin maxis come from. There's a huge amount of truth to all that. A huge amount of people get hurt, because at the end of the day, we don't all have the bandwidth to investigate everything. You know, people see the direction of travel. They see that Bitcoin has been around for 13 years. It's a natural reaction to think, well, I might be too late to that one, but if that's real, you know, so is such and such a coin. They jump on because not everybody has 1,000 hours to kind of really go down the rabbit hole, really realize that Bitcoin is sound money and has solved that innovation. So I think that's where Bitcoin maxis come from. Personally, I try not to have too strong a view on it because I feel like I have a decent understanding of Bitcoin, and it's an understanding I'm willing to stand by, but I don't understand anything else. I'm not convinced that there is a need, until I'm proved otherwise. I'm not convinced yet that there is a need for anything else other than money to be on the blockchain. And I think Mark's remarks about a blockchain needing to be defended, there's a very clear incentive structure to defending Bitcoin, and I'm not sure that exists for other things, and I'm not sure yet the need is there. But I'm not saying for sure that there won't be other things that are decentralized. So I suppose that's my view on it. I'm a semi-maxi until convinced otherwise.
Yeah, I think I've kind of taken the same path. You know, there's a kind of quote that goes around, which is that Bitcoin is more of a discovery than it is an innovation. And so I've been involved, unfortunately, in a lot of projects over the past 3 years, a lot of whom in DeFi and Web3 have kind of promised the world. And before I understood how a blockchain works and how a blockchain needs to be protected and how it needs to be incentivized, I never really asked myself, you know, could this just be done on a traditional database? You know, what's the point of putting all this in blockchain? And I thought, if it goes on a blockchain, that instantly means it's secure and it's safe and it can never be unchanged. And the kind of conclusion that I came to is, as I watched all of these projects go to basically zero, the key problems were, you know, what's the point of it? It could have just been done on a traditional database, or it was people were the problem. There were individuals who started the project and they promised the world, and inevitably when the price didn't go where they wanted it to, they left it and dropped it and it was never to be heard from again. And so now I'm Bitcoin only because of that experience. And ultimately, the kind of conclusion that I've come to is that, especially when you look at what's happened to Terra, etc., you know, recently, when I'm holding Bitcoin, my objective view is I'm never going to sell it, ever. You know, that's my genuine view. I feel like I'll never have a need to. You know, my long-term goal is I'll use it as collateral. And I have the conviction to hold Bitcoin forever, because irrespective of what anyone does or anyone says, or whether Saylor is still here in 5 years, this whole concept of, you know, TikTok next block, the network doesn't care. You know, it's a proper decentralized network that I believe was started in the correct way, and why I think it should be called discovery, not of innovation, because of how it was started. You know, the blockchain has been replicated over and over and over again by Ethereum, by Cardano, by whoever you might want to call it, copies this whole concept of a blockchain, but you can only start it properly once. And I think the way that Bitcoin was started, with just some random individuals coming together, some running them at home, people tweeting that they were started running Bitcoin, which is, you know, Hal Finney in 2011, and ultimately, as Rich said, built itself from the ground up. And so I stopped buying altcoins or any other coins aside from Bitcoin probably 18 months ago, after seeing multiple projects go to zero and realising that people and how these projects are started are the problem. And again, until proven otherwise, I think that blockchain, to be honest, currently isn't the innovation. Bitcoin is the discovery, and that's why I only want to hold Bitcoin, and I will do so for forever. But I wouldn't hold or have that conviction with anything else. And I also kind of struggle to price these other altcoins. When I look at them, I buy Bitcoin every single week because I'm never selling it. But I look at these projects that people keep saying are undervalued. But you look at the team behind it, and you're thinking at any given moment this team could fall apart and disappear. And so it's not undervalued if it can go to basically nothing. And I just don't think that will ever happen with Bitcoin, and that in 50 years' time it'll still be here ticking along. And so that's kind of why I'm a Bitcoin maxi.
We've won. I suppose I'm probably not smart enough to be a maxi, so I'm a little bit similar to the guys. Very open-minded always. I think I'd lean towards maxi, and in everything I do with Crypto With Dinny, with the sort of saving side of it, I don't think you can go wrong being a Bitcoin maxi. Like, if Bitcoin doesn't succeed, it's hard to see anything in crypto succeeding. But the opposite, I'd struggle to see that as being true. So, that's why predominantly Bitcoin would be by far the largest position. That's why any people I work with, I'm like, get your head around Bitcoin. That's probably all you need to do. Everything other than Bitcoin, I see that as venture investing, because they're all startup companies. And venture investing is high risk stuff, and there's a reason why normal people can't get access to those markets, because there's such a likelihood you're going to lose your money. For consumer protection, it's kept in private markets, so you need to have a net worth of 7 figures to get access to those markets. But in crypto, we sort of democratized investing, which I like, but what comes with that is a lot of scams. And as Mark alluded to, one of them went to zero last week. There was so much money wiped out. A lot of people lost heavily. Tens of thousands of people. So there probably needs to be some protections around that. But for me, I see Bitcoin as being, as the lad says, my long-term savings vehicle. And for me, I have small positions in some other things, but they're pure speculative. There's a very different reason for owning them. The reason for owning them is to try and make more Bitcoin, whereas the reason for owning Bitcoin is to keep it safe forever. So it's very different, and I think that's the same with a lot of the altcoins. People's reason for owning them is just to make money. So your reason to buy it is so you can sell it quickly, but that's not your reason when you buy Bitcoin, I think, when you understand it a little bit further.
My name's Tristan. I've been in Bitcoin since 2017, and some people think that Bitcoin is like a separation of money from the state, like the church was separated from the state, but is that even possible that it could be a global currency? Because I see that the main things that would affect that would be you pay capital gains tax if you would go to the coffee shop and buy coffee with it, or, and all the FUD that comes that Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment. I think the threat that governments feel is that they can't control Bitcoin like they could, because it's a decentralized network, but the altcoins are sort of centralized, and they could possibly control those. And then proof of stake, that's another kettle of fish, that that there are central actors there that can control those kinds. But Bitcoin is purely decentralized, so no one has any more power than the next person, regardless of how many Bitcoin you own. But do you think that Bitcoin could become a global currency if they remove capital gains tax? But I think that the government won't, or any government around the world won't just willingly give up the control of money, because that's one of their tools, is a control.
I think it's a bit like a Trojan horse in that the adoption rate goes up every single year, so therefore the incentive for a government to get voted in, while it very strongly is in favour of curtailing it at the start, that slowly but surely changed over time. And I think a perfect example of that is recently in America, a senator put forward a bill, it wasn't passed, but I think it was put forward that transactions of less than $200 would be exempt capital gains tax. So I think the direction of travel is quite clear, in my view. I think we've kind of seen this movie before, in that the governments would have been very afraid of giving up exclusive control of the means of communication. You had to have a license to have a radio station or a TV station or a newspaper, and eventually technology just made that impractical. And I think that essentially is what is in the process of happening again. So I think that just realizing that it's more like a parasite, and I know parasite has obviously negative connotations, but it's more like a parasite than an outside invader. It's not that, you know, the enemy ships are coming to the gates and we need to stop them. It's actually like the host itself starts to convert over time, and I just think that's slowly but surely what we're seeing.
It's game theory as well, I think. You know, if one government jurisdiction country wants to drop the ball, well, not all the world gets along. And if someone drops the ball, someone else is going to want to pick up the ball. So that's the way I see it playing out, as, you know, if one person wants to be anti and someone thinks they can get an advantage on that, you know, and we just have this constant sort of flux.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that as well. I think the kind of game theory aspect is a good way to look at it. I think especially when you've seen China ban mining and try to ban Bitcoin completely, and I think in the most recent reports, 20% of the mining is back in China, you know, so that they've tried to ban it outright, and they thought they'd done so, and suddenly there's apparently 20% of the network still there that they didn't realise. Yeah, I don't think it ever left either. I think, you know, we saw that Ireland's hash rate was 6%, clearly wasn't. We have a lot of data centres and VPNs pinging hash rate from basically all around the world, and it could have been some of that. But I think ultimately, tests like that, like the China ban, are extremely important, because if you're the US and you're looking at what China tried to do, thinking, oh, that went great, and now you see 20% of the hash rate is actually still there, you have to rethink what you're planning. And I agree with what Rich said, you know, which is, you're already seeing the game theory play out, which is seeing Wyoming, you're seeing all Texas, all these other states that are saying, you know, we're Bitcoin friendly, and other states next door are saying we're not. And now you have an influx of miners heading to Texas, you've been going to Wyoming and all these other states. And I think even on a state level, that's where it'll start, you know, between these smaller areas. And as Rich said, you'll have senators that will play to it, even if they don't believe in it. That's all part of it, you know, that's all part of kind of understanding how it's playing out. But even on a much simpler scale, you know, that's all very serious stuff, which is game theory between states and countries and individuals and China and the US. But on a very small level, you know, say I have a younger brother who's 15, 16, and he comes into the office with me and he's around miners, he has a Bitcoin wallet, he's understanding it, and that's what, you know, what he cares about. And, you know, without making comparison to gold, I'm just thinking, you know, you're seeing these individuals come up surrounded by this stuff. You know, imagine telling someone in 2011 they were surrounded by miners. You know, when my brother is my age, he'll have had miners around him in Bitcoin, and he'll understand wallets and all that kind of aspect of it. He'll have been doing it for 6 or 7 years. And so when someone comes along and one party might want to ban it, one party might want to be open to it, I kind of believe that he'll take the side of, he'll go for the party that wants to be pro-Bitcoin. And I think, again, you know, that's how the Irish government could evolve as well. You know, in Skilling, we're going to show the mining side of it and how it can lead to a more sustainable and resilient grid. And so if they're looking at Texas and how well the Texas grid is doing with their heavily renewable, because the Texas grid is essentially exactly like ours, but just much, much bigger. It'd be crazy for them to come out and say, we're going to ban Bitcoin. And so as a result, if the Irish government and our energy sector starts to take it on board, why would they ban it? You know, why would that narrative come up? If anything, they'll be the ones on the right side. And I think that this will just be a constant back and forth, which is where every state will have its own reason for wanting to keep it. And internally, those battles will go on, but ultimately, long term, the people who are coming up and taking the seats in these places are going to be individuals like myself, or Rich, or James, or Dinny, whoever it might be, and everyone's going to have their opinion, but I think that long term, people are going to be pro-Bitcoin after they see what it can do.
I'll just add to that. So, like, you're asking the question, will Bitcoin be a global currency? I think it already is a global currency. You know, it's been used all across the world. You know, there's millions of people interacting with the blockchain every day. The other question is, will it replace fiat currencies as we know today? I don't think it will replace fiat currencies anytime soon. You really want to collapse, you know, in the dollar, or collapse in the euro before it can, you know, move past what it is today. So, like, and I think in that scenario, if you look at like Moneros, you know, the regulators will block on and off ramps. In Japan, you can't buy Monero or any of these privacy tokens. So the same thing is going to be a lot of uphill battle if, you know, if we have the euro or a dollar going to a similar debt spiral that we've seen Luna go into, which is very possible. You'll have a lot of roadblocks in the way before Bitcoin become the reserve currency. They're going to bring out their own central bank currencies first, and it's going to be, you know, it's a very hypothetical future, but potential, but there'll be a lot of, you know, roadblocks on the way to that.
Yeah, why would they? There's more for a jurisdiction to collect the tax from it, because with the digital asset, you can send your Bitcoin offshore. You can't do that with any other asset. Like, so, you know, I just see it as being, it's a silly move, and I suppose China have done it many times, and then undone it. And, you know, how do you actually get rid of something that doesn't exist in a physical form? You know, is my argument. And if something that's pro, and almost Bitcoin, it almost becomes like a movement or part of a religion. And people can get drugs, and drugs are banned, they have a physical form. But it's been very difficult to get rid of drugs. So how do you get rid of something that doesn't exist, that actually helps people protect their family and their futures?
You mentioned Peter and Spencer Schiff earlier, but I think I saw a video this morning of Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the ECB, and she was asked in a Dutch TV show whether, you know, she was asked about the balance sheet of the euro and what she's going to do about it, and she was asked would she buy a cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, and she said no, and then without even being prompted, she kind of at the end of it said, well, actually my son has already bought some. So I think when you think about it, we're a conveyor belt of about 80 years of humans, and every year the oldest ones go and the newest ones come up, and when you look at the transition to younger generations, they're just so much more.
Look at the age of these guys. These are the guys that are working in the space. I'm the oldie.
And just to go on that whole concept of a global currency, I don't think it needs to become a global currency. I think this whole idea of a hedge against inflation and, you know, all other currencies going to zero, you know, Bitcoin isn't ready for that now either. You know, if that happened in the morning, the Bitcoin network and individuals' understanding of the network and how to use it isn't ready. But I think, you know, what it can do, and I think when people keep talking about this hedge against inflation, and, you know, like my dad texted me saying, you know, how could it be a hedge against inflation when inflation is this percent and it's down this percent in 2 weeks' time? And I'm saying, you know, you're comparing figure to figure every single week and you're texting me about it. But what it actually really is more so, it's a hedge against reckless monetary policy. You know, that's where the hedge against inflation comes from. It's this constant idea of when you're in an issue, you need to print money to fix it. And, you know, we've gone through now this boom-bust cycles, we've gone through COVID, and everyone's looking at it saying, oh, but it's not a hedge against inflation. They keep saying it over and over again. But what the reality is that over the course of 2 decades, we'll have another 2 boom-bust cycles. We might have 2 more pandemics, and they're going to keep printing over and over again. Eventually, people might just slowly but surely start saying, you know, this is ridiculous. Why do we keep doing this over and over and over again? And so while it might not become a global currency that we transact in, someone might say, you know, we need to start pegging it somewhat. You know, we need a new global reserve currency. It doesn't have to be the global currency that everyone transacts in, but this printing with, you know, no downside over and over and over again needs to stop. And while that might not be an instant, right, everyone's going to use Bitcoin tomorrow morning because no one's going to use the euros, what someone like the ECB in 2 decades' time, as they kind of have, you know, younger individuals running it, they might agree and say, you know, okay, we're not getting rid of the euro, we're not getting rid of the dollar, but what we might have is a more stable and I suppose a more, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, a harder money that's actually backed by something, and these reckless printing of money over and over again will eventually kind of die off. And so while I don't think, you know, you might see people transacting in Bitcoin every single day, Bitcoin will play its part, and that will only happen after we go through the process of people saying enough is enough, and slowly but surely people transferring over, and then the ECB realising, if we don't do something about this, more and more people are going to keep swapping over completely. What we need to do is bend the knee and find a balance, which is where we might have it as a reserve, and then you basically have what you've just asked, but that could take 2 decades.
I'll just say one more point on that. I think I tend to be a bit more bullish on those things. I think that people often get very mixed up between 2 different concepts. So I think some popular economists, not to mention any names, will use the fact that people don't transact and don't spend their Bitcoin as evidence that it isn't a currency or it isn't money. But actually, when you think about it logically from first principles, this is the hardest currency that exists. So it would be illogical to spend it while there are other currencies that you can use or while you can make an income. And that continues until it sucks the value from these other currencies. And like this, you know, the end state, however far in the future it is, you know, let's call it a spade a spade. It is that eventually other currencies, however fast or however slow, spiral to nothing. You have one hard currency, and then people spend the currency because there are no other currencies to spend. And everything that is spent becomes a mathematical denomination of Bitcoin. And I just think that's a very logical future. Getting there will be bumpy. But I think if you've ever listened to Jeff Booth, I think he talks about this idea called a 34th fold, in that if you ask people if you were to fold a piece of paper 50 times, you know, if everyone actually do it. Give me an estimation of how thick that piece of paper would be. You know, most people in an audience will do that or something like that. And 50 folds of a piece of paper gets you the whole way to the sun. And he talks about this idea that we're on the 34th fold at the moment, and that the piece of paper is still only that thick, but a few more folds and we're travelling, you know, a light year. So that's my view on where we go, but time is the unknown.
So you basically just touched on it there already, so you did, but in terms of, just from an economic perspective, it's arguable that obviously the governments are very smart and they know what they're doing to an extent. Again, it's arguable, so it is. But when the likes of digital currencies are introduced, such as euros or dollars, whatever it is, do you have any fear that the likes of Bitcoin might be suppressed by these, and that more people, like the general economy, might be a bit more swayed towards UST or a euro, digital euro?
I don't think they're in competition with Bitcoin whatsoever. And that's sort of just moving on from what Rich just said. You spend your euros, you spend your currency. Bitcoin is the solution to saving. Where we are today, I think, is the solution to long-term saving. So obviously in the short term, when there's not understanding, people will think, oh, it's digital, but like the euro is digital. 99% of the euros that move are digital euros. They don't exist. So, you know, I think they're not in competition would be how I'd frame that.
Yeah, I think I agree with Dinny in that regard. Like, Bitcoin has to look at digital gold, whereas these new central bank currencies will be like digital cash. Like, if you spend Bitcoin in a cafe and you buy a cup of coffee, you're subject to capital gains tax. So it stops the full circle economy for crypto or for Bitcoin. So from that perspective, yeah, it'll be completely separate. Bitcoin won't be, unless Bitcoin is recognized as a currency, like it is in El Salvador, then there's no capital gains tax on you know, buying your coffee, buying your shopping in crypto, and then, you know, you full circle economy can happen. But with the introduction of, you know, central bank digital currencies, you're going to have to cement the idea of Bitcoin being digital gold even further.
Well, I think as well, ultimately, if you're kind of have done the deep dive on Bitcoin, you kind of understand why you're buying it, and it's not because you kind of want the demise of all other currencies, but ultimately I think the swap to a digital currency is more of a, like, I don't really understand what changes, you know, to an extent, as in you're just kind of changing the word print to mint.
Your privacy changes.
Yeah.
You have none.
People might be influenced by that though, but they're not. Some people.
Yeah, to an extent, but again, I think it just goes back to the understanding of Bitcoin itself. You know, as Rich kind of touched on, people hold it speculatively, but ultimately, if people don't understand the way the currency is debased right now, they're not going to understand why they shouldn't just swap to a central bank digital currency, and that's why the majority will when it comes out. It'll be the exact same thing again, but when Christine Lagarde is giving her speeches and she's saying that we need stimulus for the next pandemic, she's going to say we're minting this many billion euros instead of printing. So I think people will swap to them. That's inevitably what's going to happen. But again, it just goes back to what's the overall understanding of Bitcoin and why you're buying it. So yeah, to answer your question, I think they will be difficult to counteract because of understanding, and people will swap to them. But ultimately, if the understanding of Bitcoin continues to increase, then they're going to swap to Bitcoin the exact same as they currently do. So.
Yeah, I won't say more than I need to, but I think that, you know, you're right, Mark. We already mint the euros though that we print. You know, we just use the word print, but we're already on digital currencies. We all use Revolut. Who uses cash? How did you pay for the tickets for this thing tonight? You know, so I don't think a digital currency, when people say that to you, it's just something that pops into their heads. It doesn't give anything to anybody that they don't already have on Revolut. But I think what it does do, and this is where I suppose caution needs to come in, is that it probably makes controlling things easier. And I won't go down into a kind of conspiratorial rabbit hole, but you know, it does mean off-ramps and on-ramps make it easier to control. It also may tie into universal basic income. That might incentivize people to switch if, you know, the central bank will put money into your account every week. How many people are going to be listening to us saying, no, Bitcoin's better, you know? So I think that's where the danger comes from, is just that a lot of people don't really care about sound money, and they will take the easy option of guaranteed €5 a week into their central bank wallet.
Okay, can we ask this guy here? He has a mic there.
My question is how easy or crypto-friendly Irish banks are. If somebody wants to buy or set up a company or business and wants to invest and sending money to Coinbase or Kraken or Bitco, are they allowed, or is there any restriction? Is it easy or is it difficult? Is there any tips to do?
We have a lot of experience with Irish banks, so I'd probably best answer this one. If you're a business, it's very difficult. The Irish banks will not work with you if you're like a broker or an exchange like us, but at a personal level, like as long as you're not opening a bank account up especially to invest in crypto, and that's the only activity going through your account is sending money to a platform like ours or Coinbase or Kraken's, like then you might run into issues. But you know, if your wages are coming in, your dollar cost averaging, 1/10 of that every week into crypto, that's no issue. You know, they might call you the first time to confirm that you know what you're doing, because again, as a lot of people, someone was pointed out earlier, there's a lot of scams in crypto, and the banks just want to protect. They have a duty of care to you as a customer to make sure that you're not sending money off to some unknown platform. But beyond that, once they know, they recognise that you're buying from a trusted platform, there shouldn't be any issues. Again, as long as your 100% activity is not going towards investing, it's only a percentage of what's going into the account.
Yeah, guys, just I work in the area of private equity and work with a lot of investment managers, and I think recently there's been a lot of interest in terms of Bitcoin and Ethereum in particular, and a lot of talk about new funds, the interest that they have from their investors in investing in both of those in particular as part of their pension plan. Can you talk a little bit about where you see that going, let's say in the next 5 years? The impact that could have on the price, obviously. And then separately, just the importance of storing your Bitcoin in a hardware wallet for the basics among us and the newbies into crypto.
Yeah, I think it's super important to store your crypto in a hardware wallet, first of all. Like some platforms have insurance up to X amount, but they don't insure you in case you're hacked yourself. So if someone gains access to your email, they can reset your, get 2FA to your SIM card, and they can do a SIM swap, and you can hear all these crazy stories. So when you have it on your hardware wallet, it's fully offline. You need to physically confirm every transaction before you execute the transaction. So in that regard, it's it's the safest option. The only thing is you need to back up your codes. If you have your hardware wallet and your backup code in the same place, worst case scenario, your house burns down, then your crypto is gone. So, I would always advise to have a second backup code in, a family member's house, or you can go to, there's like Marion Safes here, Marion Vaults here in Dublin City Centre, where you can rent the vault for, €100 in the year, and yeah, that's another option as well to keep your keys there. In terms of, pensions, in terms of crypto, it's starting to happen. I think once you see, there's no real product out there currently. I think there's some ETPs that's coming from Switzerland, things like that. But at the minute, the financial advisors in Ireland have a product to sell, they'll be selling it. So if you go to a financial advisor currently, they're going to tell you to stay away from Bitcoin. It's too volatile. There's, it can go to zero. There's nothing back in it, etc., etc. It's purely because they've no physical product to sell. They can't make money off you. What they're going to do is send you to someone like us, or send someone like Coinbase, something like that. And if there's no money for them to make, they have no interest in pushing them towards us. So I think that's going to change, when there's more, regulated funds coming on, and they're coming. There's definitely a huge wave, and there's huge, interest in it. There's a lot of demand on these pensions to produce, a fund that you can, invest in crypto. So it's only a matter of time, I think.
Just on the how to hold your Bitcoin, sometimes it can be off-putting and a barrier to entry that, geez, before I buy this thing, I have to figure out what a wallet is and a private key and how to store it. And then, you see, you own all the Bitcoin then. And I have a problem with that. So I don't trust myself 100%. Okay? So I think to get started, and James is dead right, like, by holding your private keys, that's the most secure way you can store your Bitcoin. But I think to start off, it's okay to buy it and have it on a platform, be dollar cost averaging and having a small portion of your wealth there. You're almost hedging yourself. I like to self-custody some, but I don't trust myself 100%. So I don't self-custody at all. And with a trusted third party, I'll allow them to hold some of my Bitcoin. But I don't trust them 100%, that's why I don't let them hold all of my Bitcoin. So, with the, regulation is going to help Bitcoin's price appreciation. Regulation ultimately is going to be a really, really good thing. And that's why the sooner I think people understand Bitcoin before it gets the regulation it needs, the better. Because once that regulation is around it, I really think because we will look at the price of Bitcoin or the market capitalization, money is going to flood into Bitcoin, because from all the chats, like, Bitcoin is a better savings technique than anything else out there. And what is a pension? It's only an ability to save for the future. So it's inevitable that they're going to dip a toe in, and by these huge funds dipping toes in, that moves the price of Bitcoin a lot.
I think that what we'll see probably in the investment world, just my own theory, is that you'll see that it'll be like game theory, like everything else. But the first funds to put some money in will put 1%, 2%, or 5% in. They will slightly outperform the funds that don't touch it. Those other funds will say, well, here we'll hedge 1 or 2 or 3%. Then it kind of escalates up, and then perhaps we end up in a world where we don't need funds. that's not personal, of course. But no, I just think that's how it works out. I think that it's natural selection, it's competition. It's when funds that do make an allocation do better, that just eggs everybody else on, and I think it increases. So I think we'll go from an average allocation, which is now 0% of your average fund, to 1%, to 2%, to 5%, and I think it will continue to creep up over time, and it will just take acceptance, normalization, and all of these things that we see every time a technology changes.
Yeah, and I think the almost investment infrastructure around how you can invest in it from a private equity and a long-term perspective will continue to change. You've likes of on-chain capital in the US offering it, or Fidelity, offering it in their 401ks. And this whole idea of having a pension and having Bitcoin in it, again, I think it goes back to me personally thinking that Bitcoin would be the only one that I'd be happy to have in there, knowing that it'll still be around in 50 years' time. Just because I think that having a team or having individuals around a project ultimately, eventually opens yourself up to that risk of kind of an internal failure within a project. But aside from that, I think private equity, etc., are just waiting for the vehicles that they need to put money into it. Because obviously, what we might recommend is buying spot Bitcoin, because it's the best way to invest your money. None of these funds want that. They don't want to expose themselves to the risk. They don't want to hear about wallets. They just want exposure one way or another. And a lot of people are looking at ETFs, or they don't want to hold Bitcoin, but they're willing to buy MicroStrategy or mining shares. It doesn't really add up in my head. But what they'll inevitably want is a basket, which will probably have all of them. That will be kind of the first way they get a bit of exposure, which is they might have some Riot or Marathon, they'll have some MicroStrategy, maybe even a small amount of some sort of Bitcoin ETF, and that will ultimately develop up to the point where they understand how they can just hold spot Bitcoin themselves. But I don't know, you look at around at how people are worried people are about holding Bitcoin on a hardware wallet or by themselves, and I think anyone taking on that kind of external risk isn't going to do so anytime soon. And so they'll just be waiting for these vehicles to come along where that'll allow them to invest in Bitcoin, and once they do, then I think the doors will kind of flood open a small bit.
So skilling sounds like a very, very impressive operation, but very capital intensive. So just wondering, given that Irish investors are so conservative, can you reveal how you managed to raise, without naming names, funds for such a capital intensive operation?
Well, I suppose that's actually something that we kind of learned over the past 2 years, which is why we kind of changed our model a bit. So, initially when we started skilling, we wanted to raise, a lot of money to own all the infrastructure ourselves, and be like the big miners in the US that own all their own machines, and that's how they operate their business. But ultimately, the kind of conclusion we came to is that in Ireland specifically, this model is still highly unproven, and people don't really understand it, they don't really respect it. So while you're trying to go out and get funding for what we would love to do is, build an anaerobic digester ourselves and pair it with Bitcoin mining, right now what you can kind of find is you'll find an investor who will fund just an AD and they want nothing to do with mining, or you'll find an individual that just wants to fund mining. And for us, the numbers didn't really stack up, so what we kind of switched to is this concept of selling the infrastructure to allow individuals to mine themselves, which kind of removes, relating back to your question, it removes that need for such high capital investment at the beginning from our perspective, and that ultimate kind of startup cost, as you were saying. So, skilling at the beginning was just funded by a single individual who kind of funds myself and funds everything that we've done over the past 18 months. And our goal kind of over the next 12 months is to just sell as many of these containers to individuals as we possibly can, and that's kind of how we build up our own assets. And so, to kind of answer your question about it being, highly capital intensive at the beginning, we realised that, and so that's kind of why we pivoted to building out our ability to manufacture and sell infrastructure, and that's kind of how we inevitably want to scale to owning our own infrastructure in the future.
Just two quick questions. Last one's going to be a bit of a fun question, but the first question is, for 3 in 1, to buy and so if you want to buy crypto, for example, I use, especially for us in Ireland, Binance and Crypto.com. So I want your opinions on those. And then cards, for example. So I use Crypto.com card and Binance card. So like I heard you say earlier, Dinny, that you can't buy a coffee with crypto. Well, I bought a cup of coffee just yesterday with crypto, with Binance.com. So just your opinions on Crypto.com, Binance, how you buy the Bitcoin through those two, and those two cards, your opinions of those. And then the last question is a fun question, and I'm going to ask it in this way so you will answer it. So as a game, if you had to play a game, just to guess in a year and a half time, so the end of 2023, what, if you had to guess, play a game, what do you think Bitcoin would be? That's the last question.
Congrats on asking 2 questions I feel uncomfortable answering. In terms of exchanges, I've used a few different ones, but I'm certainly not an expert, so I don't want to give an opinion on that, if that's okay. I'll wait till everyone else will do maybe the guesses at the end altogether.
Yeah, in terms of exchanges, I don't really have too big a preference on where I'm buying from. I have bought off Bitcoin before. I've used Kraken. I've used Coinbase. Obviously, people are getting pretty upset these days about the whole idea of KYC and AML. But ultimately, for me at the moment, I'm dollar cost averaging my Bitcoin every week, and I kind of swap between exchanges. I don't really pay too much attention to it. I have actually never used the cards that you're mentioning as well. But I do think that this idea of using Bitcoin, as you kind of mentioned, to buy a coffee, I think ultimately if something came along where, like Strike are doing in the US, where I had an app just like a Revolut card, which would, when I wanted to make a transaction, would buy Bitcoin and use the Lightning Network to process the transaction, I would swap to that. So kind of those cards are great, and I'd actually love to see something like that come to Ireland that's even better. Because obviously I use Revolut a lot at the moment, and as people said, you don't want to spend your Bitcoin, but if I could use the Bitcoin network to make a transaction, and if I could replace Revolut with Strike in the morning, I would. Because then you're not selling the Bitcoin that you own. All you're doing is using the Lightning Network to process the transaction. And so hopefully, while those cards are great, we get a few more.
Yeah, shameless plug. I'd used Bitcoin before I'd used those platforms. But yeah, in terms of cards, you have to be aware that each transaction you do is subject to capital gains tax. So if you're buying, it can be a nightmare for your accountant. Each coffee you buy, you must go to your accountant each day saying when you bought that crypto, when you sold it. You're not actually spending Bitcoin. The back end, Crypto.com, Binance, are converting your Bitcoin into euro, and then your euro is being spent. So what I would do, I would wait till there's Bitcoin hits a certain price, I cash out a chunk, have it in my bank, and then you can spend, and it's a lot more easier. So I wouldn't get too carried away with the crypto, these crypto cards. They might sound appealing, but in the long term, it's going to cause you a lot of headaches. At the end of the year, tax, the account comes knocking. Yeah, I'll leave the price prediction, I guess.
I'll do the price.
Maybe we'll do the price at the end. We've got 2 questions and then.
Okay. Last 2.
Last 2 questions and then we'll do the price, okay?
I'm gonna forget it now.
I won't.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you guys. My question is to you, Mark. How often the miners broke? How often they need to be serviced, and how you overcome the heat they are generated?
Yeah, so I suppose the best example that I can give personally with how often the miners break, we've had our 5 S19s in Cork City. We probably got them up and running at the beginning of October, and they've been running 24/7 since then, and I haven't had a single issue with them. They've basically been running full tilt since then. They are very sturdy machines. There's probably an assumption that they might be a bit dodgy or something like that, but that one there that I brought from our office in Cork City has been running since October. It only gets turned off when I bring it on kind of journeys like this. And I suppose in terms of what goes into keeping them going, there's very little. You know, I have actually taken them all apart into pieces and cleaned them, but before I did that, they were showing absolutely no issues. And so I think personally, I would just be from now on visually inspecting them to see if they're picking up dust. And if they are, then you can just give them a quick clean, which is basically just spraying air through them to make sure they're clear. And so I suppose just to answer your second question then, which is dealing with the heat, that's something that we spent months doing in skilling, you know, because when we decided that we needed to swap at the beginning to more of an infrastructure company and build the understanding in Ireland as to how this is going to work, we ultimately had to build the understanding of how these machines work ourselves and, you know, how you build a container. And they're, you know, managing the amount of heat that these things put out is actually, you know, pretty incredible. Is when people come down to our office and they stand in front of the 5 of them that we have down there, they can't believe how much heat is coming out of a small box. And obviously we're putting 70 of them into a 5.5 metre long box by 2.5 metres wide. And the answer is just a lot of fans. You know, that sounds a bit ridiculous, but and where we lay out the fans, and so we have spent months and months and months kind of practicing airflow and seeing how hot they get and everything. And you know, the container design that we have now is kind of like 13 fans at least getting the air out of these things, and then there's a lot more to it, which is, you know, you have to figure out how you recirculate the air. So things that people don't even realise is that because of how much heat is coming out of these machines, if you have a frosty morning, you can get condensation inside the container that can destroy the machines that you might not even realise until it actually happens. You can have things like fog passing through the container. You know, you might not even realise that would do something because the fog then condenses. And if that happens over time, over months, over years, the machines might seem like they're fine, but what's actually happening is that moisture and all that dust, etc., is building up inside them, and it's slowing them down. And so your miner might die one day, and you might think, oh, this has been running grand. But what's actually been happening is moisture has been building up inside it over months. And so managing the heat has probably been the biggest issue that we've had over the past kind of 10 to 12 months. And ultimately, we kind of think we have it figured out now, but there is a lot to it.
Last question, is it?
Okay, this gentleman and then this lady. She's going to be the last one. And then we can go back to the money question. That gentleman there?
Hello, yes. Yeah, thanks very much, guys, for a very, very interesting, thought-provoking presentation. My question is this: one of the great pillars of Bitcoin is that it's decentralized. I have a concern that governments are not going to like that. If they succeed in regulating it so that all coins have to be held on a regulated exchange, then you have the situation where if it's not your key, it's not your coin. And so basically governments could decide, okay, I think we're going to tax everybody, and then they're going to instruct all the exchanges to take 10% of everyone's Bitcoin. The second problem you could have is like what happened in Canada, where Trudeau decided to freeze the crypto assets of anybody who had their money on an exchange in Canada. Have you any thoughts on those two potential regulatory problems down the road?
I think that's just really easy. Not every government in the world is going to decide that at the same time. And anyone who owns Bitcoin, they don't have to hold their Bitcoin in Ireland. If the Irish government decide they want to tax my Bitcoin, you know, it's not like anything physical, it can move anywhere. I'm sure the lads will.
That's a bit like holding an offshore account, then just make that illegal.
Well, technically, I'm not selling my Bitcoin. My Bitcoin is on an unhosted wallet. I'm here for the movement and I'm not alone.
But, for example, you're supposed to declare any offshore accounts, so, you know, they'll regulate that too, like.
Sure, when they do, don't they?
No, I think.
Yeah, but I just don't see it happening, is what it is.
It's kind of like the Bitcoin mining. So if China did something similar to what you're proposing in terms of mining, completely shut it down, and mining just picked up elsewhere. So there was a big danger about decentralization of mining. To be honest, there was probably over 50% of the hash rate was coming out of China back in 2020. And there was, you know, that was a danger in itself. That is, what if the Chinese government, instead of shutting everything down, what if they took over the miners and they corrupted the Bitcoin network? And what they did, they banned Bitcoin mining in China, and it became a more decentralized thing by spreading across the world, a lot of into the States and things like that. So I think the same idea in regulations. So if Ireland takes a bad stance against cryptocurrencies in terms of you must be stored in hosted wallets, you're going to have other countries that are going to see that opportunity, and there's going to be a flock of innovation too there. And I could even see China unwinding its position on Bitcoin mining in a couple of years' time when they see the success of other states pulling away and how important Bitcoin is to their economy. So yeah, it's definitely a possibility. There's no doubt about it and they're going that direction in terms of winning the EU. So yeah, there's a big responsibility on all of us too to call on our MEPs and to express our opinion on what we accept or what we don't accept, because they make decisions on a flash and they don't really understand, or they don't have much understanding of crypto, or it's just they side with whatever side they're on, they follow suit.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that kind of side of things as well. When I was watching the headlines coming in about this proof of work ban in the EU, and obviously the travel rule, etc. UK were pretty stringent on what they were going to do with their crypto side of things, but it was almost as if when they saw what the EU was doing, it was 2 or 3 days later, you started seeing the headlines coming out saying the UK perhaps might start taking a strong view on crypto in terms of the positive. And I think ultimately that game theory will play out. Obviously you could have a situation where the whole world at once agrees that they're going to heavily regulate it, but we've seen how things play out, and for every loser there's another winner somewhere else. And I think that's ultimately how this game theory, not only in regulation but in hash rate, and will always play out. And so while I agree Ireland might take a strong stance, I think if the European Union does that, the UK won't, and vice versa. And of course, I hold my Bitcoin properly and I record everything properly. I personally have nothing to hide when it comes to Bitcoin. I know you might say that they might take that 10%, but ultimately if you're doing everything correctly, then you shouldn't be worrying about that in the long term anyway. Of course, you might worry about it in that if you put it on a centralized exchange, they might take it away. But if that came about, I'm not going to put it on the centralized exchange. I'm going to move to somewhere where it's more crypto friendly, and I'll go from there. But if the case of the whole world takes a given view on it, I've been kind of going along the correct way over the past 2 or 3 years, and that's kind of the view I take.
I concur.
Okay, last question then.
Yeah, it's a very short one. It's just, I had a quick look around the room, and the gender balance is very...
I counted 10 on the list.
Yeah, is that across the board? Is that every event you do? Is it in your businesses? Is that what you see?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
For Crypto With Dinny anyway, it's like we get one girl on and 20 lads in a session, 2 girls maybe.
And is it increasing at all?
No.
Okay.
I would say it's definitely increasing.
But like it's increasing because the male is increasing, but the ratio is not increasing. Not from what I'm seeing.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I just say one more thing about that? Yeah, it's a great point, and I did count on the sheet before we started. And this is my first event, so I've no experience with this stuff before. But from talking to people, I almost feel like I shouldn't say it, but there seems to be a massive difference in interest, and I don't know what it is, but there seems to be a difference in interest in terms of just I think the questions you get back. I don't know, maybe we're framing it in a certain way, so I'm not really sure why it is, but I think it's a very interesting point to raise and one to be cognizant of.
Would you say it's the same in economics and finance in general, or an even wider?
I don't know.
There's a blockchain week on next week, starts Monday, Blockchain Ireland week, and there's a host of women speakers at it. There's even a blockchain working group for women in blockchain as well. So there's definitely, it's definitely improved. When we started going for the conference first, there was 0, so whatever, 12, 10 it is a big increase. So yeah, next week there's a lot of female speakers and female panelists. So.
Okay, that it. So last question we're going to ask, about the prices. What do you think, lads? Your own opinion. In a few years,
My idea of the
all
price-
these institutions get involved in it, because
Yeah,
they
like-
are going to get involved in it.
My idea of the price of Bitcoin is simple enough. It's just like, it's my long-term savings vehicle. So in the short term, I don't know what it's going to do. But every 4 years, it's programmed to get scarcer and scarcer, and scarcity is where value comes from. A large part of where value comes from. So in 2024, there's going to be less Bitcoin we're going to have to argue over. But not just in 2024, every 4 years for the rest of my life this happens. So, with a degree of certainty, from just my understanding of Bitcoin, I see in euro terms that my Bitcoin will be more valuable, or things priced in Bitcoin get cheaper, versus things priced in euros are getting more expensive. The exact figure I'm not sure of, but it's my savings vehicle. I just want to put the money in and have it there. I'm happy if I can do that, if I can keep the purchasing power of it. But with Bitcoin, it's allowed me to increase my purchasing power. The figure, I don't know.
Did you, at the end of every podcast, you asked your guest this exact question, so I think this is a bit hypocritical.
Okay, my bearish, I'll give you my tenure. My bearish is 500k by 2030, and my bullish is 10 million. So somewhere in the range.
I'll go next just so I don't want to go last, that's okay. Yeah, again, in the spirit that this is just for fun, of course, because with all the caveats we've given, who knows? But I think you asked specifically about the end of 2023, and I think you have to say that we've never seen the macro environment that we have today since the start of Bitcoin, or since Bitcoin was founded or invented or discovered, as Mark said. So nobody really knows how this is going to play out over the next few months. Personally, I still think Bitcoin will always be higher after 4 years as a kind of general rule about adoption and mindset and psychology and all this sort of stuff. So I think it could be lower than it is today by the end of 2023. I think my answer would be slightly different if you had said the end of 2024, just because of the 4-year general rule. But I think it'll probably be in the somewhere between 1 and 200,000.
I might have to give a boring answer. No, I think I kind of agree with what Rich is saying. I think we've never actually had to deal with a traditional finance market, bear market, while Bitcoin has basically been in existence. Obviously, 08 was the start, but in terms of its growth since, it hasn't had to endure the kind of macroeconomic conditions that it's been in. But I think the answer I would genuinely give, as I think it would basically be the same. That's a boring answer, but when you say the end of 2023. I think we could just range between this and 50, but I think the kind of key takeaway, and the only reason I say this is because every time it goes down, my friends text me asking me, have I lost my job? But while it seems boring, and while we might range, we might see go back to the 60s or the 70s, irrespective, as Rich said, of how boring it gets, it's still here. You're not going to have a team that's going to leave it or run out of funding or get bored or swap to a new project that's cooler, or have Luna 2 or whatever it might be. I think the key takeaway for myself is that I do think it could be the exact same price basically by the end of 2023, but nothing's going to change for skilling, nothing's going to change for anyone else that's involved in it, and it's going to keep ticking along. And so, to give a slightly less boring answer, I think between 50 and 100k.
Yeah, I think people, I hear it repeated a lot, Bitcoin's never been through like a recession or a downturn, but people forget that Bitcoin was born in 2008 from a recession, people looking for an alternative payment method, looking for alternative money. So it's in these times, and high inflation, when people start questioning money and start getting more drawn to what Bitcoin is and start questioning, no one questions money in the good times, it's only in the kind of downturn or inflation that people start questioning money. So in short term, it's very hard to predict, anything can happen to crypto. There can be, Mt. Gox coins can be released onto the market, and we could, take a 10% dive. So you have to it's very hard to look, that kind of short term, kind of, year and a half. But if you look, in a 5-year horizon, and what Dinny was saying earlier, but if you look at the market cap of gold at, $10 trillion, why can't Bitcoin reach that in the next, 5 years? So that would put in like Bitcoin at $500,000 per coin. So that's what I would predict.
Financial advice.
Not financial advice. Guys, I want to thank the lads for coming up and for coming here. Give them a good round of applause, please.